Good morning. I hope everyone had a restful evening. Again, I just want to express our gratitude to the presenters yesterday, members of the public that provided comments, and the discussion, presentations, and dialogue from yesterday will greatly aid us today and in moving forward. We got a lot of good comments during the session, but I want to recognize that some people hadn't had the opportunity to make comments. Some people might want actually to look at the materials and think about them a little bit more before they make comments. And so we're publishing a request for information in the Federal Registry notice. It'll be on the committee's website, so anyone can submit comments to HRSA, and we review everything received, and we'll continue the discussion at the May meeting. I also want to reiterate that as we looked at revising the nomination package and the process, our intent is not to add additional burdens. We really are looking for a way to reduce the burden on nominators and at the same time stay true to making our decisions based on the available evidence. So those are just some introductory comments to get us started. We have a few topics on the agenda today. We're going to start with public comments. We'll then have a presentation from the evidence review group on the Krabbe disease expedited evidence-based review. Then we'll have a committee report from the community liaisons on Krabbe disease. We'll have discussion, and then we have scheduled a vote on whether to recommend Krabbe disease to the recommended uniform screening panel. Assuming we have time towards the end of the day, we're going to have updates from New Steps from APHL and any other new business. With that, let me turn things over to Letitia for some administrative issues.
Good morning, and welcome to all our visitors here today. I'm going to first start with roll call, and then I'll give a couple of announcements. I'm going to start with the committee members. From the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, Kamala Mistry.
Here.
Michelle Kajana.
Here.
Ned Clonge.
Here.
Carla Cuthbert from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
I'm here.
Janine Cody.
I'm here.
Christine Dorley.
Here.
From the Food and Drug Administration, Paula Capacino.
I'm here.
From the Health Resources and Services Administration, Michael Warren.
Here.
Jennifer Kwan.
Here.
Ash Shalal.
Here.
Sean McCandless.
Here.
From the National Institute of Health, Melissa Parisi.
I'm here, and Molly Manier will also be covering for me during a few times where I won't be available this morning.
Noted, thank you. And Shanika Ponputkul.
I'm here.
And for our organizational representatives, from the American Academy of Family Physicians, Robert Ostrander.
Here.
From the American Academy of Pediatrics, Deborah Friedenberg.
Here.
From the American College of Medical Genetics, Cindy Powell.
Here.
From the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Stephen Ralston. His hand is raised. I think he's here. From the Association of Public Health Laboratories, Susan Tanksley.
Here.
From the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, Scott Schoen.
Here.
From the Association of Women's Health, Obstetric and Neonatal Nurses, Shakira Henderson. From the Child Neurology Society, Margie Ream.
Here.
From the Department of Defense, Jacob Hogue. From the Genetic Alliance, Natasha Bonham.
Here.
From the March of Dimes, Siobhan Dolan.
Here.
From the National Society of Genetic Counselors, Kate Wash-Falkley.
Here.
And from the Society for Inherited Metabolic Disorders, Sue Berry.
Here.
And from the Association of Maternal and Child Health. Okay. And that completes roll call. Thank you. I just have a few announcements for folks. Just a conflict of interest reminder. This is a note to committee members that you must recuse yourself from participation in all particular matters likely to affect the financial interests of any organization with which you serve as an officer, director, trustee, or general partner, unless you are also an employee of the organization or unless you have received a waiver from Health and Human Services authorizing you to participate. As in the case today, when a vote is scheduled or an activity is proposed and you have a question about a potential conflict of interest, please notify me immediately. You can also email me or just come up and find me. According to FACA, all committee meetings are open to the public. If the public wish to participate in the discussion, the procedures for doing so are published in the Federal Register and/or are announced at the opening of the meeting. Today, we will have one public comment period, only with advance approval of the chair or the designated federal officer. May public participants question committee members or other presenters. Public participants may submit written statements, and we did receive written statements, and those were shared with committee members. For visitors in this building, you must remain on the 5th floor. There is a cafe right across the way here. There's also a smaller store where you can self-pay to buy drinks. They have snacks and things to your left there. There are bathrooms, 2 bathrooms over by the cafe, and then 2 bathrooms just behind us on each side. And if for whatever reason we have to evacuate the building, we will evacuate the same way that you all entered the building, out of that door there to the left. For those of you that are joining us online, please note, since we'll be beginning with public comment, you will be promoted to a panelist and able to speak, but it may be a slight delay, about 5 to 10 seconds. And those are all the announcements that I have. And I turn it back over to Ned.
Thank you, Letitia. I want to thank committee members and our organizational reps for reviewing the February 2023 meeting summary and providing us, November. Well, I appreciate you reviewing February too, but this time I appreciate you doing November, providing us comments. The changes were made, and we set you a new version for you to consider today. With that, are there any other corrections to the November meeting summary? Hearing none, could I have a motion to approve the November 23 meeting summary?
Motion to approve. Yep.
So I have, I'm trying to decide who was online that did that.
Kamala Mystery.
Oh, thanks, Kamala. So Kamala moved and Michelle
I'll
seconded.
Yes, thank you.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, committee members will do a roll call vote.
Kamala Mystery,
Approve.
Michelle Kajana,
Approve.
Ned Colonge,
Approve.
Carla Cuthbert,
Approve.
Janine Cody,
Approve.
Christine Dorley,
Approve.
Paula Capacino,
Approve.
Michael Warren,
Approve.
Jennifer Kwan,
Approve.
Ash Lowe,
Approve.
Sean McCandless,
Approve.
Melissa Parisi,
Approve.
and Shanika Pompako.
Approve.
Thank you.
Meeting notes or summaries approved. I appreciate your vote. We're going to move into the oral public comment period. By my count, we have 8 oral public comments. The majority, but not all, will be focused on Krabbe disease. I have an order and I will call folks up to the microphone in that order. And then I'll remind the 2 folks providing comments online, it takes just 5 to 10 seconds before we hear you. First, I have Matthew Ellenwood.
My name is Dr. Matthew Ellenwood, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of the National MPS.
Hold just a second. We can hear you, but I'm not sure if people online.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My name is Dr. Matthew Ellenwood. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the National MPS Society. I'd like to thank HRSA and the ACHDNC for the chance to speak with you today. The National MPS Society is a 50-year-old patient advocacy organization that advocates for the mucolipidoses and the mucopolysaccharidosis disorders. We have the distinction of having the greatest and most successful experience with this committee and RUSP nominations. When I came before you 2 years ago to speak in support of the nomination of MPS II, I pledged that the society and its members and staff would do everything we could to support successful implementation of MPS II newborn screening. I'd like to come before you today to provide you an update with our activities over the last year. In the areas of scholarship, the Society has been active in the research of Dr. Michael Gell by assisting in the reconsenting of dried blood spots to improve newborn screening, second-tier testing for the MPS disorders. With Michael, we've been able to publish endogenous biomarkers that reduce the false positive rate to virtually zero for MPSs 1, 2, 3A through 3D, 4A, 6, and 7. Additional areas of scholarship for the Society have included invited publication commentary in the seminars of medical genetics on the Society's perspective of and guidance of an optimal RUSP nomination submission. Finally, the Society has been helpful and co-sponsored and convened and continues to manage an active Delphi consensus effort on the clinical management of MPS II cases identified through newborn screening. The Society has been active in areas of outreach to newborn screening programs through co-sponsorship with the University of Minnesota and APHL, a 3-day symposium on newborn screening in the MPS disorders this last April. This was followed up by a luncheon held by the Society for HPAL attendees at the APHL Newborn Screening Symposium in Sacramento this past October. These have been incredibly well-received events, and we've got an excellent commentary on them. We brought newborn screening into our society in the person of Amy Caviglia, who now sits on our scientific advisory board. We have expanded our extramural funding program to include newborn screening efforts, and I'm pleased to say that we have an active program funding RTI International to expand MPS screening beyond MPS 1 and 2. Beginning in 2018, and with the vision and support of our board, and in response to the MPS 1 nomination, the Society began having a social work outreach program called Pathways. This is a program that involves outreach to families during their first year of diagnosis. This has been incredibly successful and has now been expanded to include 2 full-time social workers, one of whom is a trained genetic counselor. They spend 100% of their time traveling and visiting with families to provide support to them where they are, including home visits. We administer to families who are English and non-English speaking, and these include languages such as Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, Farsi, and Urdu. After their first year in Pathways, families are encouraged to continue family support services through our family support. I'd like to emphasize that membership in the Society is free, and these services are free. Membership, I guess, is free for all of you as well, so I encourage you to think about joining. In addition to these outreach programs, we've also identified that we're not serving the entire patient population. So we've started outreach programs in underserved areas through our Crossing Paths program and have hosted events in Texas, Georgia, New Jersey, Colorado, and California over the last 2 years. In addition to these social outreaches and scholarship, the Society has been active to advance advocacy at the state level, including discussions with diagnostic labs and newborn screening programs. Board members, staff have been presenting at state newborn screening programs in Wisconsin, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Alabama, Texas, Oregon, Arizona, and Iowa. And we have participated in outreach to clinical programs through pediatric grand rounds and presentations to follow-up groups in places like Children's Hospital Colorado, Children's Hospital of Orange County, Harbor UCLA Medical Center, and the University of Iowa State Family Children's Hospital. As we look forward to full implementation of newborn screening for MPS 1 and 2, I'm pleased to report that we now have 2 additional states who are screening for MPS 2, as well as a host of others to follow. Based on the Society's calculation and incorporating RUSP alignment, we predict that by the end of 2025, over 55% of the birth population will be screened for MPS 2 in the United States. We feel certain this is an underestimation. I know there are representatives on the committee now from Tennessee and New York who are actively working to implement, so their numbers don't necessarily count to our estimate based on RUSP nomination. That number for MPS 2, we expect to reach 95% of the birth population by the end of 2025. As I conclude, I would like to remind the committee and observe that advocacy here is here now to assist. And in fact, we have been here from the beginning. The very foundation of medical genetics as a subdiscipline rests on the combined work of clinicians like Ivar Folling and parents like Britt Egeland. The beginning of newborn screening by Bob Guthrie is intimately related to his perspectives as a father and an uncle. We help to build and strengthen newborn screening systems in this country, and our mutual mission will only profit from greater advocacy engagement. With that closing, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Matthew. Next, I have Anna Grantham.
Good morning. I am Anna Grantham, the Newborn Screening Director at the Hunter's Hope Foundation. For 25 years, we've wept with families reliving the same nightmare caused by a symptomatic diagnosis of Krabbe disease. Their baby is born seeming to be perfectly healthy. Just a few months later, the baby is relentlessly screaming in pain. Those who have encountered a baby as they become symptomatic with Krabbe disease are forever haunted by the baby's piercing, high-pitched scream. It's unlike any sound a typical baby would make, and it's indicative of the agony these innocent babies endure. After weeks or months of suffering and misdiagnoses, parents learn their baby will continue to suffer as they rapidly lose milestones until they are unable to swallow, cough, speak, laugh, smile, and have lost almost all basic and voluntary function. Parents are told they will need to use a suction machine at all times to manage their baby's saliva, that their baby will need a feeding tube, and that it's too late for their child to receive any disease-altering treatment. They're told to take their baby home, make them comfortable, and to prepare for their funeral. If you think the benefits of infantile Krabbe newborn screening are insufficient, then you do not understand the horror of Krabbe disease. We're not just talking about an early death. We're talking about an early death preceded by agonizing suffering. Krabbe disrupts every system and function within the body, and 100% of these children die, usually by their second year of life. No child should have to suffer like this when there is a screen and treatment available. Newborn screening for Krabbe profoundly improves length and quality of life. Children diagnosed and treated early are spared from the suffering untreated babies experience, and they are so full of life. They go to school, they play with their siblings and friends, they're independent, they smile, laugh, communicate, and they live. The current nominated protocol was developed following discussions with Dr. Kalanch and others last spring, and includes cytosine to identify babies with infantile Krabbe disease without falsely identifying babies who are not at risk. These babies can be cost-effectively screened at birth with other RUSP conditions and diagnosed in time to have a chance for a better and much longer life. They deserve to have this chance. When there is a newborn screening process that avoids false positive screening outcomes, why wouldn't you give affected children a chance to live? In 2009, Krabbe wasn't added by a vote of 8-7. Last year, it was a vote of 7-7. We are so close to giving every US child with Krabbe disease a chance at life. Please help us save these precious children's lives. Vote to add Krabbe to the RUSP today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next, online, we have Carlita Blackwell.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Carlita Blackwell, and I live in Missouri with my husband, Ryan, and our vibrant 7.5-year-old boy, Ezra. I'm sitting here before you once again as the mother of a child whose precious life was saved by newborn screening. There's not a day that goes by that we aren't aware of the vastly different life that Ezra would have if he had not been transplanted after receiving the diagnosis of Krabbe disease. To be honest, I strongly feel that I shouldn't be sitting here before you again. I wish that a year or more ago, you saw the indisputable, life-giving opportunity that screening for Krabbe disease gives children and their families. But tragically, you did not. And since your vote last year, we've lost numerous children in our community to this devastating disease because they were not given the opportunity to be screened at birth like my son. After receiving Ezra's diagnosis through newborn screening, we were devastated. But to be handed this diagnosis with all hope taken away of being able to receive a treatment because it's too late is quite simply cruel. I can't fathom what parents who live in a state that does not screen and receive this devastating diagnosis experience when they learn it's too late, and that if only their child had been born in another state, they could have received a treatment that would have allowed them to live a full and happy life. A full and happy life, how does one define that anyway? I can confidently say that anyone who meets Ezra does not see Krabbe disease. They see a bright, social, and comedic little boy. We're met with looks of disbelief when they learn of his disease and realize that had he not been born in a different state, he would not be here today spreading his infectious joy. I want to take the opportunity to not only tell you what we see as Ezra's parents, but what any person who is fortunate enough to meet him sees. A vibrant first grader who was recently moved from spending 60% of his time in general education to now spending over 80% of his time in general education with his grade level peers. Ezra loves school and has continued to excel. He's a 7-year-old boy who loves riding his bike, eating ice cream, and helping make dinner. A boy with a lot of opinions, he's a pro at telling you exactly how he's feeling, whether it's a squeal of happiness or giving us a hard no when he's done with something. He has countless meaningful friendships at school and in our community. If you've met him, you know he's never met a stranger, but kids have a special magnetic draw to him. To see these friendships develop over the years has been a true gift. Ezra's just a typical boy who loves to play tag at recess, attend summer camps, swim in the ocean, and tell silly jokes, because laughter is truly his best medicine. I'm not sure what more I can say today to convey to you the critical and urgent importance of adding Krabbe to the RUSP. A fun-loving, joyful child leading a full life should be enough, and there are so many others doing so just like Ezra. It's no debate that newborn screening for Krabbe vastly improves the lives of children with this devastating disease. I plead that you not only hear, but truly listen to the stories of children living with this disease after transplant. In the end, I hope that you recognize that all children, as well as their families, are deserving of the same opportunity as Ezra, not only to save their life, but to live a life they love. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Carlita. Next, we have Amy May, who is also online.
My name is Amy May. I want to give you a family perspective about Krabbe disease.
is a cruel disease that leads to a horrific death if left untreated. Dylan was the happiest of our 3 sons until he was 6 months of age. At that time, he started regressing in skills, and we went on a diagnostic odyssey. We were blindsided by the diagnosis of Krabbe. We felt robbed of our healthy baby. We felt deceived by the clean bill of health he was given with his newborn screening results. Krabbe could have been on the screening panel in Tennessee, but it wasn't. We lost Dylan's chance to live because he wasn't screened at birth. I'd like to describe to you what it was like to have a child with Krabbe disease. Dylan survived until he was almost 5 years old. We spent 4 years of our lives dedicated to his care, but there was no hope for his survival. Please picture your child or your grandchild with these symptoms. He was a gorgeous, happy baby until shortly after a 6-month checkup. And his first symptoms were that he could no longer suck his thumb. He started crying a lot, and he did not sit up on time. He was diagnosed with Krabbe disease at 8 months of age. The disease progression happened slowly and painfully over the next 4 years. Dylan lost the ability to move his arms and legs of his own accord. He lost his abilities to eat solid foods. We spent 5 hours per day feeding him thickened milk and pureed foods because he loved it. He never spoke. He went blind. Those beautiful blue eyes could not connect him to us or to the world. He had seizures. He cried a lot, and we held him for a large portion of the day to try to ease his pain and let him know that he was loved. Dylan died one cold January morning in 2009. We had to put our son from our arms into the arms of an employee at a funeral home. Then we had to walk away. We had to lower a child-sized casket into the ground. No one should have to do these things with a child. Dylan could have lived if he had been treated for Krabbe shortly after birth, like Carlita's son was. Our other 2 sons and our adopted daughter experienced this loss also. We've all dealt with complicated mental health issues as a result of this grief and complex trauma. If you can save a child through treatment after newborn screening, you can also save the whole family. Now picture this. My husband and I are both carriers of the disease. Our older 2 sons have been tested and they are also carriers. Therefore, Krabbe disease could affect one of our grandchildren. Can you even imagine going through this twice? You have the power to prevent that. Screening for Krabbe disease at birth will save the lives of innocent children. I implore you to add Krabbe disease onto the RUSP. Thank you for listening to A Family Perspective.
Thank you, Amy. Next, we have Kelly Denoy.
Good morning, members. My name is Kelly Denoy Bonacorsa. I'm joined today by my husband, Mike Bonacorsa, and her daughter, Sophia. Sophia and I were here with you about a year ago in November of 2022. It was 7 months after she was diagnosed with early infantile Krabbe disease. A diagnosis that came too late for early treatment and intervention. Tragically, now my child and my family are trapped in a painful numbers game where Sophia suffers needlessly because she was born in the wrong state. As an active duty family, we are required to move frequently, and these moves often come with costs, whether it be emotional or financial. However, I never thought that our military move to Virginia would come at a real life cost for optimal intervention and improved health outcomes for our daughter. I feel so unlucky that Sophia was born in Virginia, where she was unable to get newborn screening for Krabbe disease, since the Commonwealth does not screen for Krabbe, largely because the disease is not on the recommended uniform screening panel. If Sophia had been born in my husband's home state of New York, she would have been screened for Krabbe and able to benefit from early treatment and intervention. Our state's newborn screening practices impacted a timely diagnosis, worsening Sophia's symptoms. She did not gain the expected developmental skills. She lost skills previously achieved. She suffered needlessly for months with irritability, difficulty feeding, and gastrointestinal reflux. She developed additional conditions, including loss of motor skills, inability to feed, difficulty seeing, stiffness and spasms in the muscles, as well as seizures. She experienced extended pain and suffering from countless medical errors in clinics and long hospital stays. The damage to Sophia's brain caused by the undiagnosed Krabbe disease made it impossible for her to be offered a treatment or therapy to treat the disease. On account of this, Sophia is now a medically complex child with severe limitations and physical disabilities, all of which are permanent. She depends on around-the-clock skilled care, special equipment, and assistance with activities of daily living because she cannot walk, sit, talk, or eat. Newborn screening for Krabbe disease sets the condition for affected children and their families. It gives children and families the opportunity to receive early treatment and intervention to help stop the progression of the disease. While Krabbe disease is rare, the ability to screen early is life-changing for a child. And you will see evidence of it right here in this room when you look at Sophia and you look at Owen, who's here today. Newborn screening for Krabbe disease is the kind of life-changing opportunity that needs to be available for all children and families. This committee's decision last year to not recommend Krabbe disease to the panel of conditions was a decision in favor of a delayed diagnosis and children that suffer. It's time to implement recommendations in favor of newborn screening for Krabbe disease. I urge the committee to support newborn screening for Krabbe. Any further delay will only guarantee that more children and their families suffer needlessly and miss the opportunity to receive optimal benefit from early treatment and intervention. More children in the US should not have to suffer and die to force change. Thank you for your attention today. I truly value the opportunity to be a voice for my daughter and my family, and for other children and families impacted by Krabbe disease and newborn screening.
Thank you, Callie. Next, Kristen Webb.
Oh, hello. I'm Kristen Webb. I'm a mother of two beautiful children, both affected by Krabbe disease, but with very different outcomes. Our daughter, Mabry Kate, who's obviously not here with us, was born in 2014 when Krabbe was not yet screened for in our state of Tennessee. Because of this, my husband and I spent an agonizing 4 months of her short 10 months and 3 weeks of life in and out of doctors' offices and hospitals, desperately searching for a diagnosis. Much like you heard some of the other families describe, that was a lot like her life. But we were desperately searching for her diagnosis when a simple screening could have told us what we needed to know from the start. It wasn't just agonizing for us, We cannot even begin to describe the amount of pain that Mabry Kate was experiencing during this diagnostic odyssey. Voting against Krabbe to be added to the RUSP not only robs children of their lives as it did Mabry Kate, but it also robs parents like us of the right to obtaining crucial information about the health of their newborn baby, as well as the autonomy to make the best decision for their family. It's crucial that we put this life or death knowledge in the hands of the parents. My husband and I would give anything to have had the opportunity to decide what was best for our child. Had we had this information to begin with, Mabry Kate's life would have looked drastically different. In fact, it would have looked a lot like her brother Owen. Owen also has Krabbe disease. The difference, it took his sister's suffering and death to give him a chance for early diagnosis and life-saving treatment. He will be 9 years old in March. 9. His sister died before her first birthday. The difference is so drastic. The treatment he received has radically improved his life. With Mabry Kate, each day we were scared of what Krabbe would steal from her next. But with Owen, we get to wonder what success is and milestones he will reach. We are here today, Owen especially, to hopefully help you see beyond labels and statistics on a piece of paper. He's a vibrant second grade little boy, has participated in sports such as t-ball, soccer, and he loves golf, and is a thrill seeker, willing to ride any roller coaster he's tall enough to ride. He's hilarious and loves to tell jokes, and he's the local celebrity at his school. Every student wants a high five, a fist bump, or a hug every time they pass by him in the hallway. Yes, he uses a walker. Yes, he uses a wheelchair. Yes, some things come hard for him, but these things are not what defines his life. It's the pure joy that radiates from within his beautiful heart, mind, and soul, his infectious laugh, his determination and fight he willingly puts forth each day, and the love that he has to give through his extra tight hugs, and so much more. That's what defines him. All of this has been worth it, and every child born with Krabbe deserves the same chance that Owen has had. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Next, we have Joanne Kurtzberg.
Hi, my name is Joanne Kurtzberg, and I'm a pediatric transplant physician at the Duke University School of Medicine. For the past 3 decades, I've studied treatment of patients with leukodystrophies, lysosomal storage diseases, and inherited metabolic diseases with hematopoietic, also known as blood stem cell transplantation. The goal of this therapy is to replace the patient's blood and immune system with donor cells producing normal enzyme, which is missing in the patient. In addition, enzyme-producing microglial cells are replaced in the brain. We know that this therapy corrects enzyme levels in the blood and has variable penetration in the central nervous system. After transplant, as long as full engraftment is achieved, normal blood enzyme levels are observed for life. In Krabbe disease, where both the central and peripheral nervous systems are affected, short people, are affected, transplant rescues the central nervous system, but it's less effective in the peripheral nervous system. In addition, in infantile disease, transplantation is most effective if performed in the first 3 to 6 weeks of life. This both justifies and challenges newborn screening for Krabbe disease. As you know, newborn screening for Krabbe disease has evolved over the past 2 decades. Thanks to the outstanding and courageous work of Dr. Joe Orsini and his team in the New York State Newborn Screening Lab, Dr. Mike Gelb at the University of Washington, and Dr. Dieter Matern at the Mayo Clinic, the algorithm for newborn screening for Krabbe disease has been developed and optimized. Today, the application before the Advisory Council for Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children to add Krabbe disease to the RUSP reflects over 2 decades of work, which has allowed us to, 1, define the best testing algorithm for use in newborn screening for Krabbe disease, and 2, define the core disease to target. This is the third time Krabbe disease has come before this council. The first nomination in 2009 was not approved because of problems with low specificity of the testing algorithm, a high incidence of false positive results, and disappointing outcomes of transplant in the initial patients identified with infantile Krabbe disease in New York State. By 2021, when Krabbe disease was renominated for the core condition of early and late infantile disease, the testing algorithm using a Gauss-C screening assay, followed by reflex or second-tier testing of cyclizine at screen positive samples, had been implemented in some states and was shown to have high sensitivity and specificity for diagnosis of infantile Krabbe disease, but lower specificity for later onset Krabbe disease. In addition, the benefits of transplant in babies with infantile Krabbe disease, that is, the disease with the onset of clinical symptoms in the first 12 months of life, were published and shown to be significantly improved over prior reports, although it wasn't clear that this was appreciated by all of the reviewers. However, identification of babies with a risk for later onset Krabbe disease was not as specific and resulted in notification of risk to some families where in reality a risk was not present. Concerns related to these issues led to a tie vote, which is a negative outcome. So why are we back again? First, we know that the diagnosis of Krabbe disease through newborn screening is the only way to rescue affected babies from the pain, suffering, and early death associated with infantile Krabbe disease. It also prevents parents from undergoing months of suffering with their babies while experiencing long diagnostic odysseys, only to learn the diagnosis at a time when it's too late for treatment. We know that transplant is beneficial for these babies and strongly believe that parents are entitled to learn about their baby's diagnosis and options for treatment in the newborn period. So what is different about this nomination? How did we improve over the prior ones? First, we narrowed the core disease target to infantile Krabbe disease, where the results of newborn screening are clear. That is, the Gauss-C screen is low and cyclizine is greater or equal to 10 nanomolar. Second, we included in this nomination the clear recommendation that the testing algorithm should consist of a Gauss-C screen followed by reflex testing of cyclizine in all screen positive cases. With this approach, the rare baby with infantile Krabbe disease can be diagnosed in the first week of life and referred for consideration for transplant today and maybe gene therapy or other therapies in the future. I want to spend a minute dispelling myths about transplant for infantile Krabbe disease. First, I know transplant is not the final answer and that it's not perfect, but it dramatically improves the survival, function, and quality of life outcomes of babies with infantile Krabbe disease. It's the first of what I believe will be a series of steps leading to continuous improvement of the effective therapies for this disease. I know as a hematologist oncologist that if we had stopped treating children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 30 years ago, after the first drugs produced remissions only lasting 3 months, we would not be curing 80% of children with ALL today. Progress in the treatment of challenging diseases is incremental, but you have to start in order to succeed. Second, I know that no babies are transplanted without evidence of active clinical disease, which is present on neurophysiologic and imaging studies of babies with infantile Krabbe disease in the first few weeks of life. Third, I know that the preparative regimen, high-dose chemotherapy, does not cause the peripheral neuropathy associated with Krabbe disease. I know this because I've transplanted many other young infants for congenital immunologic or hematologic diseases using the same chemotherapy, and these children do not have peripheral neuropathy post-transplant. Lastly, I know that rapid referral for evaluation and treatment of newborns with infantile Krabbe disease is possible if the proposed testing algorithm and a prospective roadmap for rapid referral and treatment is in place. In summary, newborn screening for Krabbe disease saves lives. It also significantly improves the quality of life for these babies and their families. In the past 7 years, 51 babies were born in states who were not screening for Krabbe disease, and these 51 babies had no chance. We listened to the feedback from the committee and addressed your concerns. It's time for you to vote in favor of adding infantile Krabbe disease to the RUSP to improve the lives of affected babies and their families. please vote to approve infantile Krabbe disease for addition to the rest today. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I want to thank all of our public commenters today. I especially want to thank our parents, the parents who've come here or talked with us online. This is important work that the committee does. I think recognizing the ramifications of decision-making in terms of real people and real families and real experiences is an important part of the process for the advisory committee on heritable disorders of newborn and screening. So I thank you. We're going to take a brief break, about 10 minutes. We'll start promptly at 5 till the hour. And thanks again. There was an additional person who signed up, doing everything right for public comment that somehow got dropped off the list. And for that, I apologize. And to make up for our error, I wonder if we could start with a public comment from Timothy Miller, who is online.
Hello, and thank you. Sorry for helping to try to get our voice out there as well, but I'd like to thank the advisory committee for providing both myself and Forge Biologics the time to voice our support for the adoption of Krabbe disease to the recommended uniform screening panel. Now, my name is Tim Miller. I have a PhD focused on gene therapy, and I'm the CEO of Forge Biologics, the only biotech company advancing a gene therapy for patients with Krabbe disease. I've been developing gene and cell therapies since the late 1990s and have worked in both academia and industry for over 25 years. As a side note, including gene therapies for the MPS disorders, and fully support their addition to the recommended newborn screening panel as well. Today, I wanted to just add my voice to the symphony of voices, urging you to recognize the impact your vote holds for our community and the potential future of patients with Krabbe disease. Timely identification through newborn screening is vital for the success of not only early intervention with transplant, but also for the potential of newly developing gene therapies as a potential future treatment option. It's not just a recommendation, it's a necessity. There's plenty of published evidence demonstrating that HSCT demonstrates efficacy in Krabbe patients and their lives after they've been diagnosed as newborns, and certainly outweighs many of the risks compared to not receiving any treatment at all, as clearly evidenced by Owen before you today, and the potential to have helped the 51 babies mentioned by Dr. Kurtzberg. If the infantile Krabbe population is left without access to newborn screening, this will undoubtedly slow the progression of any new treatments, and as irreversible damage will have already occurred by the time of a symptomatic diagnosis. Early identification equals early intervention, and like most therapies, particularly those amenable to gene and cell therapies, the earlier that we can treat, the earlier we can beat this devastating disease. You know, it's as outlined by the committee's bylaws, the overarching goal of newborn screening is to improve the health-related quality of life of newborns. And I would encourage you in your role as committee members and even parents to evaluate the benefits to those being screened or with the potential to be screened. Yesterday, we released news that 5 infantile Krabbe patients that have been treated with our novel gene therapy, FBX101, following transplant. It's important to note that all of those children were identified through newborn screening. These children are walking, running, climbing, speaking, a milestone that children with Krabbe disease are typically robbed of, and enhancing the benefits of transplant. We believe that this continues to show the benefit of screening every baby for this disease. Our job is to help provide hope for these families affected by this horrifying disease. And again, I would just like to urge the committee to act decisively this time in support of addition to the RUSP and embrace the transformative potential it holds for countless future families. Thank you for your time and for recognizing the gravity of this matter. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim. At this time, I've become aware that there's a question one of the panel members would like to ask of Dr. Kurtzberg if she's willing to come back up to the microphone. Thanks, Joanne.
This time I'll keep it down.
Scott?
Thank you, Dr. Kurtzberg. I wondered if you could comment on the availability in your clinical experience as everyone agrees you're the expert in this area. In your clinical experience, are there potentially challenges in availability for donors for HSCT for patients from a non-white background? And just if you could, recognizing that this is an off-the-cuff question and that you don't have access to all of your data, just your thoughts on that.
Sure. So full disclosure, I'm a cord blood banker and transplanter, and I run a public FDA licensed cord blood bank, which has really become the source for rapid donor procurement for people who are non-Caucasian and need a quick transplant. It also causes less graft versus host disease and fortunately doesn't have to match as closely as adult donors. And in the setting of Krabbe or other leukodystrophies, monocytes from cord blood and macrophages from cord blood actually have better engraftment in the brain than from adult donors. So there are many advantages to cord blood. You can do a search to the NMDP in like 10 minutes and identify a roster of potential cord blood donors. And because you can go as low as what we call 4 of 6 or 8 of 10 match, there are always donors, regardless of race or ethnicity. Then working up those donors takes 5 days. And so a donor can actually be shipped, because it's an off-the-shelf cryopreserved product, it can be shipped to the transplant center within a week, from start of the search to the end of the process. Even in Krabbe, where we recommend you screen for Gal-C level in the cord blood unit, which is possible, so you don't pick a carrier donor. It's that short an amount of time, which is much shorter than the child actually getting to a transplant center. But to your main question, 95+% of individuals, including babies with Krabbe, who are of non-Caucasian ethnicity or ancestry, can find a cord blood donor.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Joanne. Before we start our series of presentations on Krabbe, I just wanted to provide a couple of reminders to committee members and people in the room about the vote today. For the purpose of the vote today, the committee will be using our current decision matrix tool rather than what we've talked about, thinking about changes and modifications going forward. Our approach to evaluating the evidence uses a decision matrix that assesses the net benefit of screening all newborns, the certainty of the evidence regarding the net benefit, the feasibility of implementing a comprehensive program of screening for the condition, and the readiness of the public health programs to implement such a program of expanded screening, including an assessment of the costs to the newborn screening programs to expand screening for a condition under review. All committee members have been given the current decision matrix as well as guidance to the use of the tool. With that reminder, we're now going to hear from Dr. Kemper and Dr. Lisa Prosser on the Krabbe evidence review. Dr. Kemper is the lead of the evidence review group at Nationwide Children's Hospital and professor of pediatrics at the Ohio State University College of Medicine. Dr. Prosser is the Marilyn Fisher Blanche Research Professor of Pediatrics and Director of the Susan B. Meister Child Health Evaluation and Research Center. Dr. Prosser also holds an adjunct faculty appointment at the Harvard School of Public Health. Her research focuses on measuring the value of childhood health interventions using methods of decision sciences and economics. She is currently a member of the evidence-based review group for the advisory committee and is a member of the advisory committee on immunization practices, ZOSTER working group. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Kemper.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Kalanch, and here we go. Dr. Prosser is going to be presenting remotely towards the end of the presentation, and I'm going to go ahead and get things started now. I do want to begin by acknowledging that there's no question that infantile Krabbe disease is a really terrible disorder. The presentation that I'm going to give today is going to be relatively brief in that we've presented at the last meeting extensively on issues of Krabbe disease. This is our first expedited evidence review where we're really going to focus on the change in the nomination and then present the population modeling that Dr. Proster does. There is going to be no public health system impact assessment that's going to be presented today. Let's see. Oh, let me see if I can. Oh, there we go. First of all, I want to acknowledge and thank members of the evidence review group. But let's see, here we go. Oh, now I have slide control. Maybe not. Oh, yeah, there we go. I do really want to make sure that I express our gratitude to the technical expert panel members, many of whom are sitting over there in the front row. We certainly couldn't do the work that we do without their input and the work that they do to help us understand the complex issues that we're assessing. So let's talk first a little bit about the nomination. So with this revised nominated condition, the target condition to be detected is infantile Krabbe disease. As you all know, and as we talked about this morning, it's associated with significant and progressive neurologic impairment by 12 months after birth, with death in early childhood without targeted treatment. In this case, we're going to be talking about HRSA or the transplantation. The goal with this new nominated condition is to again, focus on infantile Krabbe disease and not later onset Krabbe disease, which for the purposes of this evaluation is really everything that has onset after 12 months after birth. Screening as nominated is a two-tiered process. The first tier is looking for low galactocerebrosidase or GALC enzyme activity. And for those that are found to have low GALC enzyme activity, the second tier test is cycosine, and 10 or more is considered to be positive. One question that I've been asked a couple of times that I'll just put in here now is that the cycosine test is complicated enough that it simply can't be done as the first tier test. And that's why there are these two tiers. But again, both of these can be done off the same dry blood spot. So right now there's variation in how newborn screening for Krabbe disease occurs across the states that do use it. So for example, some states use molecular testing. Most states, but not all, use cycosine as a second tier test. But right now, the states that are using cycosine as a second tier test have a threshold of 1 or 2, between 1 and 2 to consider it to be positive, not the 10 that we're going to be talking about this morning. So I do want to highlight, first of all, the sources of new evidence that have emerged since our most recent presentation. So I'll be talking about information that we've learned from the state newborn screening programs that include dry blood spot cycosine as a second tier test. These were surveys and conversations that we had with those newborn screening programs. And we'll be talking about the accuracy considering cycosine threshold of 10 or more. We'll also be talking about the number of infants with infantile Krabbe disease that would be identified that way. I'm going to be talking about a published survey of families regarding attitudes about Krabbe disease newborn screening, published study of health disparities related to Krabbe disease identification. And then I'm going to be spending a significant amount of time talking about an abstract that's going to be presented at an international meeting. Actually, the international meeting is next week, so you're getting the first public look at this information around outcomes for infantile Krabbe disease who received transplantation around 1 month of life. So first, let's begin by talking about newborn screening clinical validity. So it's important to recognize that many of the cases of infantile Krabbe disease actually have cytosine levels that are far above the threshold of 10. And there's likely to be a very low risk of infantile Krabbe disease with newborn dry blood spot cytosines below 10. So there are some reports of cytosine less than 10 in residual dry blood spots, but the thought is that the reason that these levels were below 10 is because of lack of stability of the cytosine. There's also one case, and we talked about this case in depth last time, of a child that had an initial dry blood spot cytosine concentration of around 1, who was later diagnosed with infantile Krabbe disease. When you read the case report and talk to the people who were involved in this patient's care, there's some thought that the atypical course raises concern about whether the subject met the clinical criteria for infantile Krabbe disease or there was something else going on. But in any case, there was this one case that's out there. There's no case of infantile Krabbe disease with cytosine below 10 that's been identified by the newborn screening programs. And again, I'm going to be showing you those data in a couple minutes. There's also a low risk of identifying later onset Krabbe disease with a newborn dry blood spot with cytosine of 10 or more. So there was one article that described 11 cases of late onset Krabbe disease. And of those, one had a dry blood spot cytosine above 10. It was 12 at 460 days. So, certainly outside of the newborn period. But the others had cytosine concentrations between about 2 and close to, but below 10. And again, importantly, that there's no case of later onset Krabbe disease with cytosine 10 or more that's been identified by the newborn screening programs. So before I drill into the information that we've gotten from the newborn screening programs, again, I mentioned before that there's some variation in screening, and that extends to first-tier screening as well, and the use of molecular testing. There are 2 state newborn screening programs that do not include cytosine as a second-tier test, Ohio and New Jersey. And there are 9 state newborn screening programs that do include cytosine as a second-tier screening test. And as I mentioned before, their threshold is between 1 and 2. Now, they've identified 11 cases of infantile Krabbe disease, all with cytosine of 10 or more. I'm going to be showing you this. And it's funny, as I present this, the number 11 appears a bunch of times referring to different cases, different groups of 11. And I'm going to try to do the best I can to make sure when we talk about 11 that we understand where these 11 cases came from. So, and I apologize for how small this is, but I really do want to have it all on one screen. What you can see is a list of the individual newborn screening programs, as well as the total, which the total is going to be impossible for me to read because my words show up as I look at it. We asked these newborn screening programs to share with us their screening data from the time that they began using cytosine as a second-tier test to as far, close to the present as possible. And you can see because of that, there's variations in the days that are available and the number of infants that have been screened. But overall, there have been about 3.5 million infants that have been screened for which we have information. The next column over is the number of infants who had a positive second tier or positive first tier screen that would then go on to needing to have a cytosine as the second tier test, which ranges from as I look at the slides again, from let's see, I'm looking at the low. Yeah, it was in New York of 6.6 per 100,000 screened, up to in Missouri about 172 per 100,000 screened. So again, I want you to pay attention to the denominator, that the number with a positive first tier screen is it's a rare event. Now the next column that I've just added in shows the number of infants who had a positive second-tier test, with that being cycosine, with a setting to a threshold of 10 or more. Again, remember, these newborn screening programs use a lower number, so I asked them to tell me how many babies would have had a would have been positive with a threshold of 10 or more. And you can see that for a few of the newborn screening programs, it was actually none. And the numbers ranged from 1 to 3 in total, and it's only order of like 1 or 2% of the infants who had a positive first tier screening test. Okay, now how many of the of those with a threshold of 10 or more were diagnosed with Krabbe disease, and what's the overall rate based on the population screened? That's what this column answers. And you can see that overall, it's about 3.1 per million infants screened. I'd like to point out in Missouri, there were 3 cases that had a positive second-tier cycosine of 10 or more, but only 1 case of diagnosed infantile Krabbe disease. There was a particular issue with the laboratory that's been resolved. I'm going to be talking about that further, but in all other cases, it was 1-to-1. All infants who had a threshold of 10 or more were diagnosed with infantile Krabbe disease. I'm going to be talking about the outcomes of these cases that were identified. I do want to point out that the Illinois Newborn Screening Program was not able to provide that information directly to us, but I was able to reach out to a treatment center in the state and was able to find out about all but 1 of the cases that were diagnosed with infantile Krabbe disease. So just kind of store that for later when we talk about them. Now, one of the concerns from the previous presentation and consideration about adding Krabbe disease newborn screening was about the issue of identification of later onset Krabbe disease. So what this column shows is if you were to set the cycosine threshold at 10 or more, how many cases of later onset Krabbe disease would you not have picked up? So this is just showing that setting the threshold to 10 eliminates the identification of these later onset cases, and it shows you that the numbers range from about 3.5 per million to about 36.8 million per million infants screened. So again, setting the threshold at 10 does seem to pick up all the cases of infantile Krabbe disease and cuts out detection of later onset Krabbe disease. I do want to highlight, though, that later onset Krabbe disease doesn't mean, Krabbe disease that presents, after, a decade or more of life. This could be infants who would go on to develop significant symptoms after a year of age. So again, we're really targeting infantile Krabbe disease that is significant signs and symptoms and progression in the first year of life. So now that I've kind of overwhelmed you with that complicated table, I do want to just pull out what I think are the important lessons. So infantile Krabbe disease case detection with second-tier cytosine set at a threshold of 10, based on the information that the states provided, would lead to identification of about 3.1 cases per million infants screened. I mentioned before the issue of false positives. What happened there was that there were 2 simultaneously submitted samples that had low GAL-C enzyme activity that were contaminated with a cytosine standard. So there was a high index of suspicion at the time that that they were false positives. Out of an abundance of caution, those 2 infants were hospitalized, and cytosine was repeated at another laboratory as fast as they could do it, and that was normal, and it led to a change in the laboratory process to keep that contamination from happening again. I think this is such an outlier that I think it would be unlikely to happen again. And in the modeling and further analysis, we discounted those false positives. In terms of false negative second-tier screens, none of the newborn screening programs reported a case that would have been missed with a cytosine concentration of 10 or more. Now, there is one state that identified twins with cytosine concentrations of around 5 who received a transplant around 100 days after birth, but they did not classify those as having infantile Krabbe disease. And the thought is that they likely would not have gone on to develop significant signs and symptoms until after the first year of life. This does highlight some variability in terms of how transplant centers operate, but there was consensus from reading the reviews of those, reading the publications about these infants, as well as discussing this with the technical expert panel, that they really would not be classified as having infantile Krabbe disease. There was no case of later onset Krabbe disease that would have been identified, setting the threshold at 10. And moving the threshold for second-tier cytosine testing to 10 for diagnostic referral would eliminate the detection of about 9.3 cases of later onset Krabbe disease per million infants screened. So now I want to transition and talk about the impact of detection newborn screening compared with usual case detection. So first I'm going to talk about these 11 subjects. So these are the 11 that came from the newborn screening programs. As I mentioned, we don't have any information about one of the cases. So, for 1 out of the 11, we don't have follow-up information available. Of the remaining 10, 3 declined subsequent transplant. And we just don't have any information about what the thinking was in terms of why they declined it. But it's important to recognize that some families do decide not to proceed with transplant for their child. Of the remaining 7, 6 out of the 7 who received a transplant, and they received transplants between 24 and 42 days, are alive to at least 2 years. And in terms of their age, the median is 2.5 years, with the range from 2 to 5 years. Of these children, 1 child did receive a second transplant. 1 also received gene therapy, and 1 is planning to go for gene therapy rather. And again, this is the level of granularity of the detail. I should have mentioned before that I'm purposefully not talking about the particular states that these infants came from, because it's such a rare disease. I feel like it's important for us to do everything we can do to protect their privacy. There was 1 out of 7 of the children who proceeded with transplant who died around 7 months of age due to graft versus host disease. Now, Dr. Kurtzberg led a team that's going to be presenting at the World Symposium of Lysosomal Disorders. I think that's what the name of the meeting is, next week. And she was kind enough to share her poster with our team ahead of time and answer about 5,000 emails. So Dr. Hertzberg, thank you for that. That is an abstract that describes 6 cases of infantile Krabbe disease who received transplant between 3 to 6 weeks of age. So 5 of the 6 cases were reported in an article that we discussed previously, and they were recruited between 2016 and 2019. There was one additional case that was added. These cases were consecutively identified based on referral for transplant. Of these cases that we're going to be talking about, two out of the 11 cases that I talked about before that were identified by the states are included within that this study that I'm going to be talking about. The outcomes include the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, 3rd edition. For those of you who don't know, the Vineland is a well-accepted, high-quality assessment of development that's based on parent report of how the child is doing. It is broken down into 4 adaptive domains: communication, daily living, socialization, and motor skills, as well as an overall composite. They also assess the pediatric quality of life inventory. The quality of life data really matches up with the Vinelands, and to allow us to really focus on the key issues. That's what I'm going to be talking about this morning. So who are these 6 cases I'm presenting here? There, the middle column is the age at transplant. The column on the far right is the age at which this neurodevelopmental assessment was done. It's sorted by age from youngest to oldest, so 2.2 years through 7.1 years. And then you can see their initial psychosine level. I'd like to point out that these psychosine levels are, far above 10. So these are the Vineland scores for the individuals, again, from 2 to 7. This is the composite, and I added in these stippled lines showing according to the, whoever it is that make the Vinelands, how they classify different categories. But the composite, I think, doesn't really tell the whole story. I think it's important to look at the domains. So again, you can see communication, daily living, socialization, and motor skills. So it's really the motor skills that are far below the other scores. And you can see that they're generally doing, these subjects are generally doing better in terms of communication, daily living, and socialization. The poster also includes a Kaplan-Meier survival curve, and it includes 7 cases. So the 6 cases plus the other one that couldn't be included for the Vinelands. I want to take a little bit of time just to orient everyone around the Kaplan-Meier survival curve. So the orange line shows 51 individuals with infantile Krabbe disease born in states without newborn screening. So these are infants who develop signs and symptoms and pass the period at which transplantation would be an option. And you can see the steep decline in the first 2 years of life, and then the tail out a little bit longer. That survival curve really matches up with our previous presentation in terms of the expectation of early mortality. The blue line across the top shows the survival of the infants who were included in the study. So these are infants who received transplant around 1 month of age. The nuance that I want to point here is that represents survival from infants who received transplant and survived the transplant. So it's not necessarily what you would expect from newborn screening, right? So with newborn screening, there are going to be some families that are going to choose not to have transplant, and that would be affected by risk of mortality that would follow along the orange line that's there. And then there's the risk of mortality related to transplant that we typically talk about being around 10% or so. In either case, though, you can see that transplantation for infantile Krabbe disease during the time period that we have certainly decreases the risk of mortality compared to what typically happens in states without newborn screening. So there was a study on family perspective. I did not highlight this at the last meeting, although we knew the study. This was a survey of 170 respondents who were affected by Krabbe disease, whether it be a parent or other caregiver, that was done through an internet-based study and other sort of direct outreach. And essentially, everybody felt that Krabbe disease newborn screening should be implemented in any state. So this doesn't include the perspectives of those not directly impacted by Krabbe disease, so the general public. And it's hard to figure out exactly what the response rate was and who was responding and who was not responding, as is typical for, internet-based studies that are shared across social media. There was also another study that dealt with issues of health disparities. It suggests that Krabbe disease newborn screening reduces disparities by race and ethnicity in detection and treatment. From a pure evidence standpoint, though, we rated this as low quality based on methodologic limitations. First of all, it didn't focus on infantile Krabbe disease. The study, in terms of the timing of symptoms and treatment, excluded the major Krabbe disease treatment centers. There's a risk of misclassification of race and ethnicity, and it's not really possible to determine the timing of symptom onset and diagnosis looking at hospital administrative claims codes only. It's just not the kind of thing that occurs in there, and there was no record review. So I do want to make sure that the committee knows that this report is out there, and we described the findings more in depth in the report that's been previously given to you. But it was just, we don't want to drill into the particular findings just because we're concerned about quality. Again, it does not mean that newborn screening doesn't reduce health disparities. In general, that's a great function of newborn screening, but for this particular study, we didn't think it was reliable enough. So with that, now I'm going to transition to my friend and colleague, Dr. Lisa Prosser, who's going to be talking about the projecting the population health outcomes. This is where we model what would be expected if all of the newborns were screened for infantile Krabbe disease each year. And I hope that, Dr. Prosser, can you say something?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Thank goodness. The answer is yes.
Great. Excellent. Great. Thanks very much. Great. Thanks, Dr. Kemper. As in past condition reviews, we're using decision analysis to model the population health outcomes for newborn screening for Krabbe disease compared with clinical presentation. And just as a couple of slides on background, the science underlying the modeling is using decision analysis, which is a systematic approach to decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. And our goal here is to project ranges. And so when I go through the slides of modeling outcomes, again, I would encourage you to focus on the ranges as opposed to our base case estimates. Decision analysis allows the decision maker to identify which alternative is expected to yield the greatest health benefit. But importantly, it can also identify the key parameters and assumptions that are driving the results. Next slide, please. So for this analysis, similar to the previous analysis of newborn screening for Krabbe disease that was presented last summer, the objective is to project population level health outcomes for an annual US newborn cohort of 3.65 million. Health outcomes, both for newborn screening and for clinical presentation. On the newborn screening side, the focus is on screening outcomes, numbers of positive screens, identified cases of infantile Krabbe disease, receipt of transplant and transplant outcomes, and mortality at 2.5 years of life. For clinical presentation, we'll be projecting identified cases of Krabbe disease, both infantile and later onset. Again, projecting the receipt of excuse me, transplant and transplant outcomes within the first year of life, and mortality at 2.5 years. Next slide, please. Now, this slide shows a simplified schematic of the simulation model. So I'll just walk quickly through the top branch here. This is the same structure of the model that was used for the previous analysis of Krabbe disease, with the exception that this has now been adjusted to reflect the revised nomination protocol. So you'll see the grayed out boxes in the middle of the screen. And so with the revised protocol submitted in this nomination, with the criterion of psychosine 10 or greater, that once a baby has screened positive and is referred for diagnostic evaluation, there's a probability that be confirmed for as infantile Krabbe disease and referred for transplant evaluation, or will be classified as not infantile Krabbe disease. There could be follow-up pending or declined follow-up. We'll be modeling essentially the cases that Dr. Kemper has just presented from the most updated newborn screening program data with the 11 cases in the model. Again, just walking through the top of the model, if a baby is confirmed and recommended for transplant, they could either receive transplant or not, and typically that would be a result of a family decision. If they receive transplant, we're modeling 100 days survival from transplant-related complications or not, and then whether or not the baby survives to the 2.5 years of life. Next slide, please. On the clinical presentation slide, the simulation model projects the number of individuals, again, within a 3.65 million annual newborn cohort with Krabbe disease or without Krabbe disease. If they're identified with Krabbe disease, what the proportion has infantile Krabbe disease with onset within the first year of life compared to later onset. And again, similarly, whether or not those babies will be likely to receive transplant or not. And again, the same set of outcomes following transplant. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through the next two slides in detail, because most of the input parameters into the model have not been revised since the last analysis from the last summer. But I will walk through where we have changed assumptions. So highlighted in blue at the top, we've revised the probability of screening positive and referral for diagnostic evaluation to match the data that Dr. Kemper just presented, roughly 11 and about 3.1 million, since that's the number of babies that have been screened so far collectively across all of those screening programs. And then the proportion here that were referred for diagnostic evaluation at the top of the screen. The rest of the parameter inputs remain unchanged from the last modeling analysis and were based on published data and expert opinion, as well as primary data from state newborn screening programs. Next slide, please. On the clinical presentation slide, there has been a revision on this side of the model to update the projected number of infantile Krabbe cases expected to be observed for clinical identification to be identical to the incidence of infantile Krabbe disease derived from the newborn screening program data. And I just want to make a couple of comments on this, that in the previous model, clinical identification estimates were based on historical published data, differences in timing of identification, definitions of the phenotypes of Krabbe disease, and study populations were likely contributors to the differences between these historical published estimates and the lower observed incidence from newborn screening programs. But given that more than 3 million infants have been screened collectively across the newborn screening programs that are in place right now, the observed incidence is likely a more accurate estimate going forward. But as with many conditions, there is often and will continue to be uncertainty around these numbers, given the rare nature of these conditions. Next slide, please. Again, these have not changed since the previous modeling analysis and are based on published data. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the projected outcomes using the revised nomination screening algorithm. So for a newborn screen cohort of 3.65 million newborns, we would expect to see most likely number of cases of 11.3 with a range of 5.6 to 20.2. It's expected based on the current experience that all of those would be identified as infantile Krabbe disease and referred for consideration for transplant. In the base case, 0 projected for not infantile and for false negative. But again, keep in mind that there's a range around those given the small numbers of these conditions. Next slide, please. This slide shows projected base case and ranges for outcomes under clinical presentation. Here, the projected number of cases, and again, this is considering kind of an annual incidence, but this is really kind of the lifetime incidence for an annual newborn cohort. So we expect to project 24.2 cases of Krabbe disease, which could be identified at any time kind of over the lifetime. Of those, 11.3 are expected to be infantile Krabbe disease cases with a range of 4 to 23, and 12.9 post-infantile. So those that would, in the absence of newborn screening, would present following the first year of life. Next slide, please. This slide just combines those two slides to present the outcomes from newborn screening at the top of 11.3 cases compared to clinical presentation at the bottom, and highlighting that those are projected to be similar. Yep, thanks. Next slide. So I'm going to take just a moment to walk through this slide in detail, since this provides the projected outcomes at 2.5 years of age for newborn screening, using the revised nomination algorithm compared with clinical presentation. So in the middle column labeled newborn screening, 9.9 babies, so a proportion of those that were identified with infantile Krabbe and recommended for transplant consideration actually would be expected to receive transplant, again with a range of 3.5 to 19.9. Of those, 1 would be expected to die within 100 days of the transplant, 8.9 we expected to survive. And just skipping to the bottom, so those that would have died from Krabbe disease, so that is of those that did not receive transplant, the 1.4 that did not receive transplant, so resulting in a total across those two categories who are projected to have died either by complications of transplant or as a result of Krabbe disease by 30 months of 2.1. Compared to clinical presentation, again, starting with a cohort of 11.3 cases of infantile Krabbe, only 1.1 of those would be projected to receive transplant by 1 year of age. Of those, 0.1 are expected to die from complications. 1 would be expected to survive, again, with ranges around those projections. Of those that, and 10.2 would be expected to not receive transplant by 1 year of age of that original 11.3 cohort. Of those that did not receive transplant, 7.8 are expected to have died from the condition by age 30 months. And so the total across those two groups is 7.9. So in terms of differences, that's shown in the last column, 8.8 additional cases would be expected to receive transplant within the first year of life. And again, a range of 3.3 to 16.6. And then skipping to the very bottom with a with almost six deaths averted by the age of 30 months, again, with a range of 0.5 to 10.5. So that is the summary of the modeling outcomes. So I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Kemper.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Prosser, for that great presentation. I just want to highlight too that, you see these wide ranges and that reflects small numbers and uncertainty, but it's really important to focus on the ranges, as Dr. Prosser mentioned. So these are some of the important references. Everything is in the report that the committee has given. With that, I'd like to end and open things up for questions from the advisory committee.
Thank you, Dr. Kemper. Thank you, Dr. Prosser. Thank you for pointing out the wide confidence intervals. I don't have to. Let me open it up first, please, to questions from committee members. And if you're online, please remember to use the raise hand function. Michelle.
Thanks for that overview, Lisa and Alex. I just had a quick question about the 2 false negative cases. They were not picked up via newborn screening, but became evident via clinical presentation.
Are you talking about the 2 false
twins.
positives or the 2?
The twins.
Oh, the twins. So, they were picked up by screening and had cytosine levels of 5. And so they were below the threshold of 10. So if the threshold is moved to 10, then obviously those twins wouldn't be picked up by screening. The question that we really focused in on is whether or not those children had infantile Krabbe disease. Because if they had infantile Krabbe disease, then that would be false negatives with a threshold of 10. Right. But the consensus was that these were really later onset cases that got transplanted earlier. And again, this gets into the nuance of the terminology around Krabbe disease as well. But I think the key thing to recognize is that those 2 infants were transplanted very early on before the development of signs and symptoms associated with Krabbe disease, and that some wouldn't really classify them as infantile Krabbe disease. And there was a discussion around whether or not some people would have even transplanted them at that age or would have waited till longer.
Right. Okay. So technically they weren't false negatives.
No, they were cases that wouldn't be picked up by 10, but unlikely to be infantile Krabbe disease.
Correct. Okay. Thank you very much for the clarification.
Ash, online.
Thank you again for the presentation and the outcomes. So I think there are 2 ways of presenting the data. And so one is the table that we were shown in reduction in mortality based on the newborn screening program and including every infant that tested positive. Whether there was one lost to follow-up, some had refused treatment, and there was a mortality that was transplant related. When you look at the Kaplan-Meier curve, I think so the overall benefit, just in raw numbers from total cases identified in newborn screening, is somewhere in the mid-60s, leaving aside the ranges. I think maybe we could just talk about the means at the moment. The survival curve, and again, we have to be just cautious that these are small numbers and early results, suggest that mortality from Krabbe is potentially eliminated by transplant. The question really is, how do you reconcile the 2 numbers? Because the reason for refusal, etc., may have to do with specific circumstances under which this condition is diagnosed and the need for a very rapid decision-making, and that a few weeks are needed in which to do a lot of workup, plus bring the family along to make an informed diagnosis, which is what happens prior to each and every stem cell transplant. So I just, this is mostly a comment. I think that when we're looking at the benefits from positive identification of infantile Krabbe disease on newborn screening, I think that number, which is currently in the mid-60s in terms of the survival, may be something subject to change with a wider availability and greater experience and as the processes are further refined of taking the infants from newborn screening diagnosis to the transplant. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to reflect back on what you said, I mean, clearly there's a big difference in risk of mortality, and that just the top curve, doesn't represent every baby that received newborn screening, because it didn't include those who, for whatever reason, refused transplant, or who the small percentage who dies as a result of transplant. What I can't comment on, simply because we don't have the information, we don't know, is the decision-making process for those who chose not to have transplant. We can't comment on that one way or another.
Sean?
Sean McCandless, committee member. This maybe is a question for both of you, but probably more for Dr. Prosser. What, in the modeling, it appeared that the proportion of families choosing to have transplant was different than the revealed data that we saw. Am I misunderstanding that? Or where it looked like around 30% of families opted not to have transplant? Was that the number that was used for modeling, or was it different?
Maybe, at least if it's okay, let me preface your comments by saying, we had a lot of historical information about the rates that families refused transplant at, and then we had this limited number from these 11 cases. And so one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we included was the right number in the range, and that the baseline most likely value is probably less useful than looking at the range. And so the sensitivity analysis was expanded to include, what we learned from those from the states in those 11 cases. But Dr. Prosser, I probably shouldn't have jumped in yet. So I hope that I said that right.
No, that's exactly right. So just the note is that the range includes kind of what has been most recently observed from those 3 cases who declined transplant. And so the base case that we've used in the model was derived from published data, so a larger denominator of cases as well. But important to note that that it includes the range, so that those 3 cases, if you look at the ranges, are included there.
Let me turn to our organizational representatives to see if there are questions or comments. I'm going to start with Sue.
Thank you. And thank you for the if you turn yours off. Working.
Yeah.
Mine's not working.
Share-
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate
sharing.
that.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at you. I can't see anything when our
Dr. Berry,
glasses are on. so
sharing is caring.
Anyway, moving along. So thank you for the opportunity to comment. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Society for Inherited Metabolic Disorders. So SIMD, as you may recall, is our professional organization. for research and care for persons affected with inherited metabolic condition, of which Krabbe is a representative. We are comprised of professionals of all types, including physicians, scientific researchers, dietitians, advanced practice providers, genetic counselors, and our board of directors is made up of people representing all of those interests. So as this was revisited, we reviewed this issue as a group with great seriousness. And we took a formal poll of the board of directors about their considered opinion regarding this plan. And our result was unanimous, with no member of the board favoring this addition. We noted this with sadness because we truly, as providers and professionals, understand the importance and gravity of this condition and its impact on affected babies and their families. So in our discussion, several points were raised. First, the group was concerned about the degree of evidence that supported the impact of therapy, particularly for infantile disease. As that's the target of the planned addition, there was some skepticism about the recommended intervention and its effectiveness, which is one with significant morbidity and mortality. The feasibility of doing the transplant in the recommended timeframe that has been suggested is pretty unrealistic. So I recently had the opportunity to explore this because my own state elected to add this test to our screening panel. So our transplant team, a highly skilled group that is eager to undertake transplant, was uncertain that they could complete the necessary preparation in a fashion that would permit initiation of therapy in 30 days. I really can say with assurance that if anyone can do this, our team will make every effort to do so, but it won't be without major challenges. We heard a little bit about cord blood as an option, but the likelihood of finding perfect matches or even suitable matches is variable and can be difficult. This is particularly true for persons of ethnic backgrounds whose pool of donors is more limited. And given the time constraint, this could present an impediment to the recommended intervention and is an issue of justice in healthcare access. And more importantly, from my point of view, the justice of access for care is also limited. Given that anticipating that all the comers would be able to have a transplant, particularly in the time frame needed, presents significant financial uncertainties to families under the system. It's common for children not to be enrolled in Medicaid, for example, until well after this therapy would have to be initiated. And while retroactive payment is often accomplished, there's no real assurance that this would happen for children depending on this means of support. This is particularly true if the transplant can't be performed in the state providing Medicaid coverage. So initiation of a time-sensitive therapy that can't be initiated until financial arrangements are available presents the potential for significant inequities in care. So we asked the board what would change their decision. We offered 4 possible factors in the poll that might impact their decision. And these were an FDA-approved treatment, additional evidence about transplant from more transplant centers, additional funding for follow-up services, and additional access for patients to treatment centers. And of these, the most frequently chosen response was additional evidence regarding utility of transplant. In the end, we're professionals. We care deeply about these families we serve. And if you make this change to the panel, we will do our very, very best to serve these children. But based on the criteria chosen for addition, this particular condition doesn't fulfill the criteria for the RUSP. And so for that reason, our society recommends against its addition. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Sue. Now Scott Schoen.
Thanks, Scott Schoen, ASTO. So I have a technical question and a modeling question. So you mentioned on one of your slides and in the report that there was a mention of sensitivity, and not sensitivity. Hang on, I wrote it down so I wouldn't have this moment. Cytosine stability, wrong. So what's known about the stability? Just thinking about that most laboratories would likely send this to one of the options that you highlight in terms of a commercial option. And need to make sure that the marker is picked up accurately. What's known of the stability of and would there need to be sort of environmental controls? Because the reference was, I acknowledge the reference was to like a 6 or 12 month stored spot, but are we talking weeks? Are we talking months in terms of stability? That's my first
Yeah.
thing.
So I I'm going to give you a sort of a non-laboratory, my sort of understanding of how the universe works. So that, you know, a lot of those early studies were done on dried blood spots that were stored in, you know, who knows what environment. That's really what raised concern about the stability. Cytosine, when it needs to be measured, is going to be, you know, sent off immediately to, you know, one of the handful of referring centers. And I asked that question, and there, you know, was no concern about the stability of the cytosine within that, you know, within the, you know, days period that it would be done. The bigger concern was that, you know, going back to, you know, these dried blood spots that, you know, I always think about like that warehouse at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, who's, you know, stored back there somewhere under what environment, who knows. But there was no concern from the experts, the people that we spoke to, about the stability. Again, I don't know any particular studies that I can point to you about that.
No, and that's okay. I appreciate that. You know, and it sounds like under routine circumstances, it would be stable. My question, I think, is on the modeling side for Dr. Prosser was, you know, with the refocus of the expedited review on infantile Krabbe, in the model, there is a reference to the non-infantile forms. And if I'm reading it correctly, and that's my question, is it looks like by using the proposed algorithm of low Gal-C followed by cytosine higher than 10, there is the likelihood that a greater number of children would not be identified. I think it's 12.9, Dr. Prosser, if I'm reading your slides correctly, would not be identified through newborn screening, which I understand that that's the whole point of this. I just want to make sure that I'm reading.
Yeah, no, I'm going to, Lisa, and then maybe let you respond. But so in the modeling, it's completely true that when you set the threshold at 10, you're not identifying those later onset cases. It really, you know, that's the function of 10, as you talked about. But if you're following children over time, even though they're not picked up by newborn screening, some infants are going to develop, you know, as they age, are going to develop the later onset forms. And so the modeling had to take into account those children that would be identified through newborn screening, which would have the infantile form, as well as those infants just over time, as time progressed, would present with the later onset forms. And now I'm nervous, Lisa, again, and I hope I said that right.
That's exactly right. I think that the question that Dr. Schoen, I think, is also asking is if we compare to the previous version of the model, you know, those are likely to be the cases that would fall into that recommended for either high or low risk follow-up following screening under a different screening algorithm.
No, I appreciate that. Because I mean, when this group decided on SMA and focused on due to the deletion of exon 7, there was at least a time that acceptance that about 5% of children with SMA wouldn't be identified. And so just understanding that, it sounds to me like you're saying with this algorithm, 100%, it is, the model would say 100% of early infantile would be identified. None of the other forms would be identified, and then subject to the routine medical system. Okay, thanks.
Correct.
Yeah, correct.
Robert?
Here we go. Robert Ospina, American Academy of Family Physicians. Part of your presentation, and you appropriately said it's hard to sort out the reasons that someone identified might or might not proceed with hematopoietic stem cell transplantation for this, because it is a very, very difficult decision because the risks are absolutely real, as everyone's been pointing out. And with such who would or would not choose to proceed, I think isn't possible to estimate. And so the relative effect of that on the survival numbers is probably hard to sort out. I would suggest that in addition to the hard survival numbers, which I think is very important for the evidence review, that as at least one of the family members pointed out, that the opportunity for parental autonomy and decision-making one way or the other is, in my mind, a net benefit of diagnosing things at a potentially treatable stage when shared decision-making is what has to happen and happens all the time in medicine with treatments that have high risks and high benefits. And the actual decision often comes to rely on the value system of the family, and, not necessarily on a hard number one way or the other. But if the diagnosis is made late, the opportunity is lost. So I think that's one aspect in favor of adding it to the RUSP.
Sean?
Thank you. It seems to me that the updated nomination hinges very strongly on the requirement for a dried blood spot cyclazine measurement greater than or equal to 10 as a second tier test prior to reporting the result to the family. And so that raises several questions in my mind that I hope you may be able to address. The first is that you commented earlier that it's apparent that state labs will use one of several commercial laboratories to do this second tier testing. Is there evidence to support that? The second question is, if there are different labs used, what is the evidence around variability in measurements of cyclazine? Is a 10 in one lab a 10 in every lab? Or is there likely to be variability between individual labs in terms of the measurement? And the third question then is there any evidence about what states will actually do and state newborn screening programs will actually do around a recommendation that they only report out values that are extremely abnormal and not report values that are clearly abnormal but not meeting the threshold for reporting for newborn screening?
So those are three questions, and hopefully I'll remember all three. So one question was about the number of labs that are out there. So again, I'm not a laboratory person, but from talking to experts who are, that measuring cyclazine is not a trivial thing, and it doesn't come up a lot, as you could see from the numbers that I've showed. So that this is probably something that will remain within. I'm projecting this, of course, within a limited number of laboratories. So it's done in the Mayo, it's done through, whatever PerkinElmer's, lab is called. It's done at my institution, Nationwide Children's Hospital. I think there was somewhere else and I can't remember where off the top of my head. So there's a limited number of labs. It's a complex test. I'm hoping Dr. Cuthbert can weigh in on that once I finish with this part. We did find one study that where they compared across the labs the amount of variability, and there was great concordance across the labs. So again, that was reassuring. The third question you ask is one that's difficult for me to project. So what would states actually do? So we did talk about that as a group. One of the people who works at one of the reference labs said that, if you told me that, the state just wants us to report, less than 10 or more than 10, whatever it is, we would be happy to do that. And I think that's supported also by the recent paper that Dr. Matern shared around. But ultimately, as we've seen from other conditions, states can do whatever it is that states want to do, right? So some states report back, carrier information from some children, and they have, there's differences in methods and thresholds and stuff like that. So it goes beyond, what I can tell you from evidence review, what states would actually do. Now I'm nervous. Did I hit all three questions?
Yes, you did address all three questions. I do think that we came to different conclusions around the publication regarding variability between individual labs. As I recall in that publication, the concordance occurred after normalization to a gold standard was shared, but that the raw testing, there was great amount of variability between labs. And that really raises the question of whether there will need to be and who will provide the oversight regarding where second tier testing is performed, and is there any way for this committee to impact that?
Yeah, and I want to agree with what you just said. It was my understanding that part of the process described in that paper was to bring people to that standard, but that was, the final outcome. In terms of, what the committee can do to ensure uniformity and measure that of course, I'll defer to Dr. Kalanch and others.
Sorry, Sean, I will provide you an anecdotal piece of evidence that Colorado would have to refer its out. So I know one state. The other thing I'd point out is that TandemS spec has a number of signals that have never been turned on and aren't reported routinely. I'm pretty certain by almost all labs in the US. So I would say there's evidence to having the discipline of not reporting out abnormal signals in newborn screening, but I can't say how that would happen in this specific condition. Carla?
That was a very good question, and thank you for asking that. Our role at CDC, as you know, is to provide proficiency testing and support for laboratories and so on. What we hope to do, regardless of the outcome of the vote, is to make sure that we have a cytosine test in-house at CDC, so that any of the programs across the country that want to do cytosine within their own state programs, they will have an opportunity to do that. We have through our partnership with APHL, we do have mass spec based hands-on training that happens, and we're aiming to expand that to 2 times a year. And that's when we bring in state programs to learn best principles, new methods, and that sort of thing. And we anticipate that we will include methodologies for cytosine for any of the programs who are willing to be able to do that as well. So there'll be an opportunity, and we'll provide any support over time as they need. Harmonization is something that is also very interesting and that we find to be very valuable. We do have a lot of laboratory developed tests across the country. So one number in one state is sometimes different than another number in another states, and we do recognize that across the board for many of these non-kit based testing platforms. There are a number of states that have taken the initiative and from different funding sources to look at harmonization studies using CDC reference materials to be able to understand how do they actually perform when you sort of harmonize the data. And I do anticipate that will happen as well with cytosine, because that is going to be very important because of the attachment of the numerical value as part of the screening strategy. So we will play a very active role with the states that have an interest. We'll work with various APHL committees and subcommittees as well to ensure that there's good conversation around how this gets done, how effective it would be, any of the needs that are being identified over the course of time. We'll have the experience of the states that are currently doing it so that we can have some examples as to what challenges they run into and so on, to be able to help fulfill that role. And I hope that that's helpful and that addresses some of the technical challenges that are not unique to cytosine, but we've been finding that are very important as part of an overall best practices for newborn screening, so that you don't feel alone with your own number that is internally consistent, but may not have meaning across the states. So that's our role, and we're looking forward to being able to support states in that way.
Michelle.
Thanks for that, Carla. Just from a newborn screening perspective, we always work together, as you mentioned, with APHL and CDC in order to provide the best testing and outcomes possible for babies. And I'd say out of almost all of the conditions that have been discussed or on the core, Krabbe probably has the largest number of advocacy experts, transplanters, newborn screening programs that have worked to refine the algorithm for this. And with respect to the cytosine testing, right now, there are several labs that you can do a send out. If the laboratory that we use receives the sample by 1 p.m., we have the results that day. So the turnaround time is very quick, even if it's a Saturday, which happened recently. They all use the same methodology. They use the same set of calibrators, and they also do external PT right now before a CDC type PT is available. And so there's a lot of crosstalk between the labs that do the second tier testing to make sure that they all are getting the same answer. Thanks.
Deborah.
So my question is actually a little follow-on to Sean's concerns and a little bit of a clinical question, in that we know in many of these conditions, when we say late infantile, those children are not entirely without problems, and they may be more subtle, but they also have difficulties. And so my question was about cytosine levels that are clearly abnormal for what you would expect from a normal population, but don't reach that 10. So the question is, if the late infantile kids may be having some symptoms, and I'm not really sure about that, I was hoping somebody could comment on that, whether that would be something that should be considered as well.
Let me address this just from the evidence standpoint, and then others may want to weigh in. So it's true based on what we've seen that the infants who have infantile Krabbe disease have really levels in excess of 10. It's not like, just on the other side of 10. It's also true that later onset Krabbe disease, as I'm calling it, is really anything after 12 months of age. So it doesn't mean that those infants are going to go on to have necessarily a benign course. It's just that they're going to present with signs and symptoms after 1 year. Based on the previous evidence review, there was concern about the balance of benefit and harm for identifying those children who are going to go on to have later onset Krabbe disease, which is what led to this nomination with the threshold of 10 to really focus in on the infantile Krabbe disease population. So I agree with you, and I don't want to minimize potential outcomes for infants with later onset Krabbe disease. And I think, and again, this I don't want to cross beyond the evidence, so I'm going to turn things back to the advisory committee, right? But of course, individual states can do what individual states want to do with levels below 10, and certainly we've seen that for other conditions. But the nomination in front of us that we were charged to look at was really the benefits and harms of identifying infantile Krabbe disease, identified as signs and symptoms within the first year of life, and this cytosine level of 10 or more. I hope that answers it.
Thanks, Alex. Susan?
Thank you. Susan Tanksley, Association of Public Health Laboratories. And I just wanted to speak as a member of a state lab. I'm with the Texas Newborn Screening Program. And so any test that we bring online has to go through verification if it's FDA approved, validation if it is a lab developed test. So if we decided to bring on cytosine, we would rely upon CDC and PT materials to ensure that we appropriately set our cutoffs, and our cutoffs would be based upon that versus a hard number. So depending upon what our program decides, do we only want to pick up the early infantile, or do we want to be a little more conservative? We would make those decisions as far as what our goal of the newborn screening program is. And I think I can safely speak for all newborn screening programs that CLIA validation verification process is really important. And each program makes a decision. We're required by our statute to screen for anything that is on the recommended uniform screening panel. as funding allows. And so we, if early infantile is added to the RUSP, then we would definitely at least screen for those.
Thanks. Margie?
Margie Ream, Child Neurology Society, or GREP. I've looked at Krabbe disease newborn screening from many different angles. I also direct the leukodystrophy clinic at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. I'm on the Ohio Newborn Screening Advisory Committee and work with Alex on the evidence review group. Yesterday, Sean McCandless asked me about Ohio's experience because we have been screening for Krabbe disease for several years. But was as pointed out yesterday, Ohio does not use cycosine in the official newborn screening paradigm. But I think that, Sean asked that maybe the committee would like to hear a little bit more about Ohio's experience with that. We have identified 4 infants with infantile Krabbe disease in Ohio, all with cycosine well above 10, 40s, mid 30s and above. Of those 4, all opted for transplant. One actually resided out of state, was born in Ohio, went back to their home state for transplant and succumbed to transplant-related complications. The other 3 were transplanted at Nationwide, and all within 5 weeks of life. Our most recent one that we transplanted, I think it was November, was day 28. So regarding feasibility, it is a multi-step process that requires a big team. And obviously Nationwide is not representative of many hospitals that a lot of the country has access to, but we were able to go from never having done it to being able to do it within 28 days. And so there is feasibility, but I definitely acknowledge that not everybody has access to a hospital like that in their back door. Of the 3 that were transplanted in Ohio, one's lost to follow up. The other 2 are alive and doing okay. One is still quite young, so we don't really have outcomes for them yet. But those 4 infants, were not included in the 11 that the states that were using cycosine reported to us, to the evidence review group, because we did need to focus on cycosine as part of the newborn screening lab paradigm. And so I don't know what the other states not using cycosine have found, if they've identified any cases, but that's what Ohio's experience has been so far.
Thank you, Margie. Scott?
So just real quick, I wanted to mention both Susan and Carla have mentioned laboratory developed tests. And I just think for this committee for the future, given what's going on with FDA and CMS, that probably needs to be on the radar for the future, because it's going to dramatically impact where we go. But my comment is from, so Scott Schoen, org rep from ASTO. So it's from a public health system perspective. And it goes back to Sean's question about what will states do. And everybody so far in front of me has said states will do what states will do. And I think that we also need to recognize that decision of whether or not we honor just a 10 or above is largely outside the laboratory or even the follow-up teams. That is a public health decision with council and health officials who are going to have to weigh the impact of doing or not doing. And every state is going to be a little different. And I feel that ability to guide or control is outside the purview of this committee. It's understandably a potential risk, as some of you may feel, but I don't know that it is necessarily pertinent to that. But I do feel that it does play into an individual state and the committee's assessment of the benefits versus harms of wherever you make a recommendation in terms of that decision. And I think that because the cycosine test is quantitative and there is going to be that sort of, as Susan was alluding to, whether or not people decide to look at like a borderline range that the lab you send out to doesn't actually articulate, but you decide to work on, or you validate yourself, that's going to be up to the state. But it is fundamentally different. And I'll go back to the SMA discussion, which is when you're just looking at the absence of exon 7, whether it's there or not, is very different from a sort of this gray line of a second tier test of cycosine. So I think the data is good, but as my suggestion is, I don't think that you can, I would suggest to the committee that public health And the public health officials of each state are going to have to sit down with newborn screening and look at whatever the recommendation is, if it does go forward or not, to make a decision on where that line is. And we'll have to deal with the outcomes that are associated with that, but that there are obviously risks and benefits that you need to weigh in terms of where that line is. So I appreciate the moment.
Thanks, Scott. That brings us to the end of this discussion. First, I want to recognize and thank Dr. Prosser, Dr. Kemper, and the entire ERG team for a great evidence review and great presentations. Thank you. We're now going to break for lunch. We're going to start promptly again at 15 after 1 on our time. Remember, there's a cafeteria across the way, a store that you can get food from as well. And if you go outside, you have to be rescreened to get back in. So see you in 45 minutes. Next, we're going to move on to the committee review of Krabbe. As most of you know, for each condition that we consider for full evidence review, we select 2 committee members to serve as liaisons to the ERG for that topic. They're tasked with presenting a summary of the evidence review, formulating a recommendation for the condition rating, and assisting the chair in leading the committee discussion. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Sean McCandless and Dr. Jennifer Kwan. And then recognize that as they talk, we work with a decision matrix that might be able to put up on the screen after their presentation. So I think we'll go ahead and do it that way.
You just go down. Thank you, Ned. I'm just, should I click page down? Maybe that'll, yeah. So thank you. So Sean and I have served again as the liaisons to the committee. And we sat in on the TEP meetings with the Evidence Review Committee to look at the revised application for infantile Krabbe disease, the expedited review. The disorder of interest is infantile Krabbe disease. The newborn screening test will be 2-tiered dried blood spot screening. The first tier is low galactocerebrosidase enzyme activity, and the second tier is cycosine greater than 10. This cycosine cutoff is more specific for infantile Krabbe disease, and it reduces the number of late onset cases with uncertain outcomes who need to be followed. Overall, the new 2-tier screening improves the net benefit of screening. As you know, Krabbe disease is an autosomal recessive disorder due to the deficiency of galactocerebrosidase enzyme activity, which leads to early injury to myelin and brain cells. Neurodegeneration is a hallmark of the disorder. Earlier age of onset is associated with earlier mortality. As you have heard very eloquently, in infantile Krabbe disease, infants may appear normal at birth, then within weeks to months develop difficulty feeding, accompanied by irritability, poor head control, and poor responsiveness. Clinical exams show increased muscle tone, abnormal reflexes, and death occurs in early childhood. The treatment for Krabbe disease is hematopoietic stem cell transplant, which can improve survival and developmental outcomes in those with infantile Krabbe who are treated pre-symptomatically. That is before the development of significant symptoms and signs. HSCT procedures have been are associated with no morbidity and mortality. And since this is the only treatment offered currently to infantile Krabbe disease patients, families who are appropriately counseled have refused treatment, as you've already seen. In reviewing the data from state programs currently using incorporated cycosine in their KD screening, no infantile case was identified with a dried blood spot cycosine of less than 10 nanomolars. There was one reported case from authors in New York who presented a child with symptoms of infantile Krabbe disease who died at 2 years of life, who had multiple cycosine levels less than 2. As you've already heard, there was some discussion of whether or not the child perfectly met criteria for infantile KD disease. I only bring it up as something that was discussed during the evidence review. The specificity of the new screening algorithm is great. Thanks to the new screening algorithms, the specificity is greatly improved using the cycosine cutoff of greater than 10. All cases of infantile KD identified by states currently using KD, currently using cycosine, have had cycosine levels of greater than 10. Confirmatory testing for infantile Krabbe disease should also include other tests such as GAL-C genotyping, MRI, nerve electrophysiology. This is the final slide that table that Alex presented, showing the distribution of the cases identified in states that incorporate cycosine screening into their newborn screening protocol. And using that with a cutoff of 10, they were able to identify 11 cases. The outcomes of those 11 cases identified by screening show that one of them, there's no follow-up information available. 3 declined treatment. Of the 7 who received treatment between 24 and 42 days of life, they are alive for at least 2 years. 1 received an additional transplant. 1 received an additional transplant and also gene therapy. And 1 died around 7 months due to graft versus host disease. So the potential harms that exist for infantile Krabbe disease under this current protocol include treatment-related harms of morbidity and mortality associated with stem cell transplantation. There have been concerns raised and also discussed about equity around the availability of appropriate donors and access to appropriate sites. The higher cycosine cutoff of greater than 10 nanomolars to date appears to eliminate many of the harms that we were concerned about associated with the diagnosis of indeterminate diagnosis, shall we say, of Krabbe disease. Those children with biallelic GAL-C variants and cycosine levels between 2 and 10. These children are no longer patients in waiting and are no longer at risk for potentially unnecessary stem cell transplantation, but childhood onset disease will also not be detected under this protocol. It is possible that infantile KD cases may be missed using this cutoff. For example, in that article from Corey et al., maybe they did describe a patient with infantile KD. That's possible, but it has not been found yet. Again, just reviewing the projected outcomes using using results from Dr. Prosser. Yearly, we would expect around 5.6 to 20 cases of infantile KD identified. As noted before, this markedly improves the specificity of infantile KD diagnosis, so we don't. The range is 0 to 5 for not identifying infantile KD, and I'm sorry, for identifying an infant who doesn't have infantile KD, and then the false negative also has a range that includes 0, so 0 to 5. So part of Sean and my job was to wrestle with the level of benefit versus harms in the current protocol for KD newborn screening. And under the revised screening algorithm that incorporates the higher level of cycosine, we agree that there is evident benefit in survival for those undergoing and surviving early stem cell transplantation. The treatment data are limited, and there remain honest differences of opinion regarding the value of treatment in infantile onset cases as evidenced by family decisions. The summary of harms with this approach really is related to the treatment mortality. So here's the decision matrix that we reviewed. And in reviewing it, there were a certain number of points that came up. And I think I will let Sean take over from here.
Thank you. Again, to summarize the evidence as we see it for the recommendation to the committee, for families that choose therapy, there is a measurable improvement in the child's lifespan and in the neurodevelopmental course. Some families do not find this improvement compelling enough to opt for the therapy that is offered. And the very limited evidence that's available from the newborn screening data presented today is that that's in the order of 30 to perhaps as many as 40%, although one of those patients was lost to follow-up entirely. And I'm not sure that it's fair to conclude that was a decision, a considered decision. It appears to me that there continues to be a risk that if psychosine values less than 10 are reported as high risk by some state programs, the balance of benefits and harms may be impacted. And this slide says negatively impacted, but I think as we've heard today, and as we've heard during the previous evidence review, I think there can be honest differences of opinion about the value of identifying late onset cases and the potential harms related to the same situation. And so that's each committee member has to weigh their thinking about that individually, I think. It does appear that newborn screening programs are ready to enact screening for Krabbe and would be able to implement in a reasonable amount of time. We want to acknowledge what we heard earlier today from a variety of different individuals, that the process of diagnosing and treating infantile Krabbe disease within 4 to 6 weeks will be challenging, but as Dr. Kurtzberg pointed out, not impossible, with potential for errors and delays as there is with any medical procedure, especially things that need to be done quickly. And unless state programs tightly coordinate with their newborn screening, call out diagnostic testing and referral. So every state that does this is going to really need to have a tight system in place when they initiate the project. When we put this all together for the two of us, the conclusion that we come to is that the overall net benefit regarding outcomes of newborn screening for a mandatory population-based newborn screening program for infantile Krabbe based on low GAL-C activity and psychosine equal to or greater than 10 in the dried blood spot, that there is moderate certainty that screening would have a significant benefit. Therefore, our recommendation is that infantile Krabbe, defined by low GAL-C activity and psychosine equal to or greater than 10, is not recommended for inclusion as a core condition on the RUSP. That said, I think I speak for both of us when I say that we want to first acknowledge and thank the families who've shared their lived experiences with us today on this committee. And there's no doubt that Krabbe is a devastating and heartbreaking condition. The committee is not immune to that emotional power. The charge of the committee, however, is to make evidence-based recommendations about the public health impact of adding conditions to the recommended uniform screening panel for mandatory population-based newborn screening. The committee is charged with assessing the net benefit of the entirety of the population screened, not just individuals affected. This recommendation takes into account that earlier decisions by the committee were not necessarily based on a single concern, rather that they were based on the preponderance of the evidence available at the time. The latest nomination effectively addresses one of the concerns that was raised the last time by revising the case definition. The result, though, and that definition is outside the purview for states to identify individuals with psychozines that are below the recommended cutoff of 10. We also want to honor and take into account the real world choices of families who have been informed of the risks and benefits of therapy when they choose not to pursue treatment. We can't assign motive or make judgments based on that beyond the undeniable fact that when informed of this devastating diagnosis and the options available, not every family finds the option of treatment to be valuable to them. And we wish to honor that. But we also don't want to add meaning to it where there's not evidence to support that meaning. Finally, I just want to say that we realize that this decision will be one that each committee member makes independently and thoughtfully based on your own understanding and weighing of the evidence regarding benefits and harms. There will be differences of opinion, and we respect each of your thoughtfulness and autonomy in voting the way that you feel is right based on how you interpret the data. So thank you, and we're very interested to hear the discussion.
Thanks, Sean and Jennifer. Would you be happy to take your seats and take questions or comments from there? At this point, I'd like to throw the floor open for starting with discussion among committee members. Christine.
So I'm just wondering if it's the purpose of this committee to recommend how screening be performed and how an algorithm should be put into place to detect kids with
We're having trouble hearing online. I don't know if we can work on that. Sorry.
So I'll repeat myself. This is Christine Dorley, committee member. I was just wondering if it's our responsibility as a committee to make a decision on how screening should happen or how a screening algorithm should be developed. And I know that the nominators in putting up this disease for consideration had to come up with a very clear-cut case definition, which means low Gaussian enzyme and psychosine greater than 10. And with that being said, I'm feeling like maybe we're kind of blurring the lines between the case definition and then what laboratories should do. And then I too was wondering, do we have any opinion on the individuals who were actually diagnosed with late onset Krabbe disease, how they felt about knowing that eventually they may develop a disease later on in life, and whether they preferred to know about this decision? Because in speaking from a laboratory perspective and somebody already doing screening for Krabbe disease, implementing the psychosine is definitely very necessary to decrease your false positive reporting. But where you set that cutoff as far as meeting the case definition as defined by this nomination versus just considering reporting anything that's above, say, a 2, makes a big difference in the life of those patients. So I'm just wondering if we make this decision and we say that screening should be low Gaussian enzyme and psychosine 10, how do those individuals who would later on be diagnosed with late onset Krabbe disease, who could have gotten treatment much, much earlier, would feel about us in this particular algorithm?
I think I can answer that. The broader definition of screening for Krabbe that would include additional potential late infantile sorry, I still have trouble with that phrase, but late infantile was considered and was not passed. So this is a different definition that narrowed it down to infantile only. As such, the evidence that we had presented today versus the last time we talked about Krabbe was really narrowed down to that definition. And so what we're asking you to do today as a committee is consider screening with that case definition of low galc and high psychosine or psychosine above 10, and made that into the case definition that we would then recommend to the, if we voted for it, recommend to the secretary to add to the RUSP. So I don't know if that helps, but our intent wasn't to, again, at this meeting, re-adjudicate the issue about low galc in the setting of a psychosine less than 10. And your point's well taken. Michelle?
Michelle Kajana, committee member. I just wanted to kind of review the harms a bit because the harms that were being put forward for Krabbe are treatment-related mortality. This question of whether late onset would be identified or missed and the false positive rate, and the fact that we would require tightly coordinated networks and family refusals and what the rationale for those were. And so stem cell transplants, there's a risk no matter what the condition is when someone is transplanted, and we screen for ALD with a similar type of treatment. And so that's kind of a well-known, and the data that we presented shows about what the rate is across many different conditions. As you know, Dr. Tanksley and Dr. Dorley said, you know, the idea of whether or not you can identify the late onsets really will be subject to what the state feels is appropriate for their own, based on either advice from their commissioner, their advisory committee, or whatever. And I will say, as I sort of alluded to before, about amongst all the conditions on the screening panel, I would say that Krabbe disease is really the most tightly coordinated. We follow these kids all the way through. And so a timeline that we just observed not too long ago was specimen arrived on day of life 3, psychosine elevation came on day of life 7, plus 2 DNA variants. The baby was seen in the clinic by day 9, admitted on the day 13, and is undergoing conditioning and will be transplanted within the timeframes that were proposed, that were necessary for the best outcomes for these families. And lastly, the concern over families refusing therapy. We see this for other conditions. We see families lost to follow-up, and we see families refuse for any number of reasons. And so I'm just kind of struggling with the fact that these harms would be substantial enough to go one way or the other with a recommendation, because in reality, we deal with this related to newborn screening for many different diseases. Same kind of harms, if you will. Thanks.
Jennifer and then Sean.
I would say that I agree. There are other conditions on the RUSP in which you have families refusing to follow up and refusing to follow through with treatment. Unlike a lot of the clinicians who sit on this committee, I really think of newborn screening as a compulsory and unconsented laboratory intervention. And I think that because of its nature, the treatments that we propose for these infants should be so effective that parental refusal would be rare. I think that the machinery of public health in compulsory testing has a high bar. And that is not a bar that has been reflected in prior conditions on the RUSP. And so I appreciate Michelle bringing up the fact that invoking it now doesn't seem fair when you consider other conditions approved. However, for me, for my personal view of this program, I think that it is not a program that public health systems across, I think that it's a program that places burdens on public health and medical systems across the country because of the fact that we cannot reliably say to families that the efficacy involves more than survival and the developmental outcomes that come with that survival. And I understand that for some families that's huge, but unfortunately, in my mind, newborn screening as a public health activity is not to give families an autonomous option and information about their child. That may change, but I think currently, when I think of newborn screening, I don't think of it like that.
Respond real quick.
Yeah.
I understand where you're coming from, but I would argue that there are conditions that we screen for that create very, very medically complex children already. And there's not been any discussion on removing some of those conditions from the panels. And so I think you need to think about it in the context of how programs operate. And some of the therapies are not 100% effective and they are complicated. And I just feel as if with experience and with the expertise that's across the country for this condition, that these children will be taken care of.
Sean.
Sean McCandless, committee member. I just want to clarify, and perhaps we misspoke when we presented the data. I don't think that either of us see families refusing treatment as a harm, just to be clear. We see that as one way of understanding how parents in this situation value the benefit of therapy. So this whole discussion is extremely nuanced and challenging in this setting, and I get that. And I feel like it's just a very difficult discussion to have in this forum, to be able to be vulnerable and honest. And I want to acknowledge that. And I want to make it clear that I'm also challenged by that. That there is something special, in my opinion, about compulsory population-based newborn screening that we need to be very careful to protect. And you raised the point, Michelle, that there are other conditions where families may choose to not pursue therapy. But that's actually a very small number, and those are ones that have been added later. And it's part of the slippery slope of where we're going. Slippery slope sounds bad. It's part of the discussion of what newborn screening can and should be. And I come back to the fact that population-based mandatory newborn screening started with conditions like PKU. It expanded to conditions like MCAD. We would not in our clinic tolerate, we would make a social services referral for a family of a baby with PKU that opted to not choose treatment. We would never do that for Krabbe or for MPS 1, which is also, or for XALD. And so you raise a really good point that there are qualitative and quantitative differences in these conditions that we need to be thoughtful about. But I also don't feel that that means that we have to, that every decision just means that the next one needs to be more aggressive or that we need to continue to push the envelope. I think it's a really nuanced decision. And as I said, I totally understand that different people will have different perspectives on this. And they're all valuable, and each of us has to vote the way that our heart and mind tells us is the right thing to do. Sorry, that was long, but I apologize for that.
Yeah, I'll come to the people online in just a minute, but Dr. Warren.
First, I want to thank our committee colleagues for their review of the review and the report out, and appreciate the acknowledgement that reasonable people can disagree and that this is a nuanced conversation. I also want to comment on point where we find ourselves in newborn screening, the evolution, and you've conversations about that. And I appreciate that there's work going on with the national academies, for example, to be able to give us some sense of what does that new frontier look like. And for some of these things, we're already at the border of that new frontier. But it will be helpful to understand what are those rules, because it may be that those criteria that got us here are not the same ones that get us there. I think for me, where we are now is we've got a nominated condition with these revisions where we can identify children who may be affected. There is a therapy that saves lives. We've got the opportunity to give parents a choice. And as you all noted, not all parents may choose that, and that is very different than a family who would choose to refuse treatment for PKU. But it gives them a choice that they wouldn't otherwise have. I also just want to say, and sorry, this is more of a comment than a question. There were numerous reflections today about system opportunities. And I don't want to diminish the system issues. And I think every one of us sitting around this table, and frankly, everyone sitting in this audience and watching, is part of the system. Whether we work in state or federal governments, whether we work for advocacy organizations, whether we provide clinical care, all of us has a voice, a different voice, but a voice in that decision-making process. And we've heard examples today of where folks have figured this out and have done this. And does that mean that, if this committee votes to approve that it's going to be seamless every time? Probably not. But we at least create the space where we can all continue to push. So thank you for your review and your work here.
Let me go to Janine online.
Yeah, Janine Cody, committee member. First, thank you, Jennifer and Sean, for such a thoughtful review. But I kind of feel like there are two things that received sort of outweighed consideration. One is, and I apologize, Sean cut out a little bit online, so I didn't hear all of what he had to say. But considering or worrying about what states will do is really beyond what we can control and should try to guess at and consider. And also, I guess I agree with Michelle, as pointed out, the treatment to treat or not treat is not compulsory. To not screen at this point is compulsory for not treating. So we rob families of the opportunity to even make that choice on their own if it's not screened. So the fact that some families choose to not, after careful consideration with their clinician, does not seem to be a strong factor to me in whether to approve or disapprove. I guess I agree with Michelle on that. So thank you.
Thanks. Ash?
Hi. Thank you. I'm just going to keep my comment focused on the one thing I wanted to mention, and that's the net benefit certainty. And I was thinking through this, I was wondering why I may come to a different conclusion. And I realized that I was thinking of net benefit from treatment versus net benefit from screening. And the question, that's what's in the decision matrix. But if one separates out and thinks about the treatment itself, what we've been shown today is that those who have received stem cell transplant, there is I'm going to repeat myself, there's the elimination of disease-related mortality. And there is stability of response to the extent that the follow-up allows us to pursue that. The transplant-related mortality of around 10% is what one would expect for unrelated donor transplants. And in many conditions where the disease itself carries a high mortality, there are families and their patients who might accept a higher risk of transplant-related mortality than 10%. What we are comparing it with is a median survival of less than 1 year, if I remember the curves correctly, and pretty much zero survival beyond 5 to 6 years of age. So the relative benefit or the relative risk of one or the other really can't be calculated because you're comparing close to 100% with 0%. So where does the decision about the benefit lie? I think it might be with the quality of life that is assured after a successful treatment. And that's where it becomes rather subjective. From looking at the data today and hearing from the experts and the families, do feel that the quality of life that is assured after transplant would, in my mind, justify going ahead with the treatment. And therefore, as far as the treatment itself is concerned, I would think there's a high certainty of a benefit. And I agree that when you extrapolate that to the population level, that one may have to take some other things into consideration. But the treatment itself, I would rate it as a high benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Sean, is this in response?
Thank you. I just want to respond briefly to Dr. Law's comment, Sean McCandless, committee member. I want to be clear that the statement that we made about moderate certainty of significant benefit is related to the overall net benefit of public health mandatory newborn screening program for Krabbe disease with low GALC activity and cyclizine greater than 10. It includes both potential harms and potential benefits. No one would argue with you that the mortality benefit is clear, even from the very limited data that we saw today. So that's not, I don't want to leave anyone with the conclusion that we doubt in any way the mortality data. That is very clear. The neurodevelopmental outcomes were definitely improved compared to the baseline. There's no doubt about that. The statement about the certainty of the net benefit is related to the overall population-based newborn screening program, not just the benefit of treatment for those people who survived the bone marrow transplant. And I just want to be clear about that.
Shanika Panpakun, committee member. This is more of a comment as I am listening and thinking through this. There's a small number of cases and thank you. There's a small number of cases and thinking about the cases that decline treatment. I think we all have to keep in mind it will depend on who the family met, the historical sort of natural history may, tip the scale one way or the other. So because the number is so small, I think we just need to think about this and be very sensitive that these decisions, it could turn into 50% if one more patient declined treatment. So that's just something that I try to incorporate in terms of trying to make this, I think would be this decision. Thank you.
Melissa.
Thanks, Melissa Parisi from NIH. And I just wanted to thank everybody for a really thoughtful discussion. I think this is a challenging decision to make. I have 3 points that I wanted to make. One of which is that, as you mentioned, Sean, I think everybody weighs the benefits perhaps a little bit differently than others. I think we all wish that the outcomes were better for these kids with infantile Krabbe disease after stem cell transplantation, but they are alive. And for many families, that in and of itself is a significant benefit. I took care of a baby with Krabbe disease over 20 years ago now, before transplantation was even an option. And it was devastating for this family to watch their child just regress and finally succumb around 1 year of age. And I so wish that those parents had had an option of transplantation, or at least something that might have given them some hope. And I also feel that, you know, just because some families may decline hematopoietic stem cell transplantation does not necessarily mean that that would justify taking away the option for other families that would like to have that as a possibility, recognizing that it is not a trivial procedure and not a benign procedure, and that there is a certain mortality associated with it. My second point is really related to the concerns about the availability of hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. And I know this was raised by the very thoughtful comments that Sue Berry made from SIMD. I guess thinking about the prevalence of this condition now that we think we have better estimates, and the number of infants impacted, and the experience that has now been garnered in the 11 different states that are doing screening, that are, you know, have some fairly broad distribution across the country, not complete, of course, that with the support of the advocacy groups and with the transplant centers that do have a great deal of experience, my hope is that the approximately 11 babies per year born with this condition, if screening is accepted, would be able to access those resources and get efficient transplantation from a qualified center in a timely manner. And then thirdly, I have to put on my NIH research hat and suggest that recognizing that the current cutoff of low GAL-C and a cycosine greater than 10 helps to make this condition better defined and allows for reduced false positives. But it does break my heart a little bit that there's the potential to lose the very valuable data from those babies that would have a cycosine level between approximately 2 and 10, who are at risk for a late onset Krabbe disease form that would be incredibly valuable to know more about, to be able to follow longitudinally, and potentially have very, very reasonable and possibly positive outcomes from transplantation. So I know that that's not what we're debating today, and that's not what we're going to vote on, but I guess my call as a researcher is that it would be valuable to know more about those babies if this condition is accepted to the RUSP. Thank you.
Thank you. Cindy?
Thank you. Cindy Powell, organizational rep from ACMG. I did not survey the ACMG members nor our board of directors about this. I'm speaking as someone who's tried to keep an open mind about all of the evidence that's been obtained. I was still a committee member and presented on behalf of the NNP work group in May of 22, where we recommended that Krabbe be put forward for a full evidence-based review. And you know, I've thought a lot about the benefits and risks of Krabbe newborn screening. In listening to all the data presented, and I wish that there were more follow-up data available, but I know Dr. Kemper and the group did their best in getting what data was available. But you know, it really seems to boil down to one of the main criticisms is the timeliness of treatment and the challenges of this. And I just don't think that's enough to say that it's not worth including on the RUSP. I know, I mean, there's been publications from the clinicians in Virginia that, you know, this is going to present so many challenges, but frankly, we've always had challenges whenever there's been a new condition added. And we, you know, have been able to overcome those. Yes, I'm in a state where, you know, we have the transplant center with the most experience here in North Carolina, but, you know, the experts there are willing to share their knowledge with other states, other sites, and to be able to expedite treatment so that babies can get transplants within 4 to 6 weeks, I think is doable for the most part. And yes, there will be challenges, but I think they can be overcome. So I think the other things, Dr. Kajana definitely touched on several of the points I wanted to make, so I won't repeat those now. But basically, there are a number of other conditions already on the RUSP that, have a lot of the same concerns that have been brought up about Krabbe disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Natasha?
Natasha Bonham, Genetic Alliance. First, I have a question, I guess, to the committee. Maybe it's to you. We heard from Dr. Kwan and Dr. McCandless their views on what newborn screening is and the purpose of it. Does this committee have a shared definition or view or idea of the purpose of newborn screening that it works from? I just think that might help when people are thinking about what are we voting on. Some people say newborn screening is meant to reduce morbidity and mortality. Maybe that isn't the full definition here. So that's just a question. Is there a shared working definition of that this committee is working from? I don't know if you want to answer that before I get to
Well,
my comment.
I think there's what we have written down, and then I think it's evolving. So I would say it's not a discussion we have.
Okay. And then to the comments around therapy and understanding the perspectives when speaking to the fact that some families refused and appreciating the comments that trying not to weigh too much into that, but it seems like we're weighing into that because we're discussing it so much. And just a reminder that we talk about, we want informed decision-making for families. That means they get to make a decision informed both on the knowledge that we have, but also the knowledge they have about their own lives and how they want that to go. So I think that's a really important piece to this. And PKU has been brought up because it's always brought up when we talk about newborn screening. And I think it's already happened, but on the Hill right now, there is someone giving a speech, someone in Congress, about the fact that we need better access to medical foods. So even for PKU, it is not guaranteed, even if you choose for that treatment and want to pursue it, that you consistently have it. We have families who have PKU who still struggle to get the formula. So I think it's important to know that, these issues are part of the newborn screening system. And yes, we're all working towards it, but just to have that be really clear that these issues are not new. And in fact, they are part of newborn screening and why there are so many other programs to support families, support states. This isn't a one and done, that it's evolving.
Jennifer, did you have another comment?
Yes, I can't find the actual 2006 article that came out from the ACMG when this committee was brought together. But excuse me, I think that we all struggle to remember that newborn screening currently is for the best interests of the child. And so when there are treatments that are highly effective and are likely to make a significant difference in the life of that child, then I do think that the community, medical, family, et cetera, come together to try to make sure that those resources and treatments are available. And so when treatments are effective, it is very rare that we have issues with parental refusal. And part of the reason we may be focusing perhaps too much on the families who refused treatment for Krabbe disease is because clearly the treatment is different from, let's say, the A list of disorders that are on the newborn screening panel. And so, but I think that the charge of the committee comes from that document, right? It comes from saying that it's the interests of the child first. We need to, look at population-based net benefits and harms. I think we do have somewhat different places that we draw the line and set our threshold, and we've already heard that. But I don't know that, I think we start from that sort of basic beginning and then have our different experiences that come into it.
Yeah, I just for one moment, Sean, as somebody who worked state public health for 9 years and I'm now in my 10th year, I think for me, there's a big struggle at the interface between public health and ultra rare disease. The ability to have a population health impact in very rare disease doesn't fit within the public health framework. I'm not saying it's not valuable or we shouldn't do it, but you recognize there's an automatic kind of conflict between thinking about the burden of health for a state on the whole and the resources you bring to bear on moving the health of the entire state forward, and where does that get impacted when the number of people impacted gets smaller and smaller. Tom Friedman, I think a lot of people would argue, was a pretty good director of the CDC. And basically, if it didn't impact lots and lots of people, he said, we're not going to pay attention to it. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it's a tension around public health and the public health system when that system is used to address individual disease. Now, the reason why we do newborn screening in public health is that's the way to get the entire population. So we have a population-based screening strategy that overall helps lots and lots and lots and lots of kids, and in any one condition helps very few. And Krabbe is an area where it's very few. So that, to me, just for my own decision making, will always be an issue, a strategy about. I have to think in a tax limitation state of opportunity costs of where other places funds could go. Even though we charge the hospitals more, that's in Colorado, it's under the same rubric of you can only expand spending so much. That's not anyone else's problem, but that's my problem. And so I'm always thinking about opportunity costs. And if we do this, what are we not going to do? And I realize that's not a problem a lot of people think of, but it's one that we live with in public health in many places, and I live with really every day in Colorado. So I'm just telling you about the tension. The other thing I want to point out is that I get the issue that there were 6 deaths that didn't occur because of transplantation. I have to tell you, from a population standpoint, that is a dramatically thin data set. That is a very small amount of data on which to base a population-based decision. And you remember, there were confidence intervals around there where it went down to less than a complete life, which is not a possibility, but it's a statistical measurement. And so even my certainty around the significant benefit is challenged a bit by the small numbers and the math. And so I just wanted to comment. I mean, he said, it's a significant benefit. And I said, yeah, based on a very small evidence base. Sean? Oh, I'm sorry. Paula?
Thanks. This is Paula Cappuccino from the FDA. I have a question. If a state implements this for infantile Krabbe, Does that make the diagnostic odyssey for the late onset Krabbe babies more difficult? Or is that still something that's going to be, picked up irrespective of this screening program?
I think I can answer that. If a state lab calls out Krabbe results according to this algorithm, then those who have late onset Krabbe disease will never know that they have late onset Krabbe disease. And so if they develop symptoms, then someone will need to be aware that late onset Krabbe is not being screened for, and they should think of that as a diagnosis. An analogy might be to SMA screening, which screens for homozygous deletion of the SMN1 gene, which accounts for probably just over 95%, maybe more, of cases of SMA. But there's a percentage of cases that we don't diagnose by newborn screening. We have to be aware of every time we see a hypotonic baby and not just assume that everyone was screened. And so we don't have to think about SMA. I hope that answers your question.
Sean, I think you had something to add.
It doesn't look like it did.
Well, I do want to add to what Dr. Kwan said, which is that that's a concern that's been raised for a variety of conditions as they're added to newborn screening, because of the concern that pediatricians will assume that the disease has been ruled out completely when and not because they don't fully of a screen. The fact that there are these long diagnostic odysseys already shows that as a group of physicians, we're not always that great at thinking of the entire differential diagnosis. So I think that's a hypothetical concern, but I would be very, very hesitant to consider that a potential harm of the vote that we're going to take of the proposal that's on the table today, because I just am not aware of evidence to document that, at least compelling evidence. So it's a reasonable thought, but I would encourage the committee not to think of that as a harm related to the decision that we have, as a potential harm related to the decision we have to make today, because there just aren't data to support it one way or the other. So it's a fair thought, but not maybe one that I would recommend we take into consideration today. May I continue with a couple of other thoughts responding to earlier comments? Several comments have been made that by screening, we're giving families choices, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that by screening, we're taking away choice from other families. And Dr. Goldenberg alluded to this yesterday in data he presented, and I have personal experience with this, of families that were diagnosed with this particular condition in Ohio, who felt very angry and upset that their choice of enjoying their normal baby for the first several months of their life was taken away from them by the newborn screening program. So again, I don't disagree with any of the points that have been made or the arguments that have been made today. I think this is a very challenging discussion, but I just think that we have to be really thoughtful about all of the potential unintended and intended consequences of the decisions that we make. And remember that we're taking, regardless of what we decide, someone is not going to have a choice. The other thing I just have to come back to is that there are very few public health mandates in the United States that you don't get to choose, that are compulsory. And newborn screening is one of them. And the basis for that, starting in the 60s, as I understand it, was the fact that was the reasonable person argument, that a reasonable person would not be able to make an argument for not treating that condition. And that's, I think that is in large part what underlies public support for mandatory newborn screening. And that the more we get away from that,
maybe that's the right thing to do, but I think we just need to be thoughtful that one unintended consequence of making this kind of decision will be loss of support for public support for mandatory newborn screening. And I believe that the mandatory nature of newborn screening is one of the most compelling arguments that nominators bring to this committee for why it needs to be a newborn screening, so that no baby is missed. If we lose our public mandate for mandatory screening, then we will lose that benefit for everyone. Again, maybe that's beyond the scope of this discussion and this decision-making, but I feel like there's, this is clearly not black and white. If the question before us today were, should every parent be given information and have the choice to have screening done? There's no doubt in my mind the answer would be a unanimous yes. That we would like every family to be able to choose for themselves whether to have this. For a variety of reasons, that's not popular and not felt to be acceptable. Carrier screening is not felt to be a viable option. This would be a great example of where carrier screening would be valuable. I think it's really complicated. I think the decision is difficult. I just want to be really clear that we're not, when Dr. Kwan and I make a recommendation, it's not because we disagree with anything that people are saying. We have different concerns, different values, and also I'm not trying to convince anybody that I'm right, because I'm not sure I am, but I have my way of thinking about things, and I wanted to share that with people. Michelle.
Thanks for that and for all the great discussion today. I just want to sort of remind people that we always talk about PKU as the star of newborn screening. And in reality, when we began compulsory screening for PKU, the AAP came out against screening, and time changes and the opinion shifts. And now it's sort of held up there as a success story that everyone gets taught about, whether you're in genetics class or medical school. The other thing related to the net benefit and the number of children impacted, there's many conditions on the current panel that are exceedingly rare. We don't find in New York for 1, 2, 3 years. And for an example, GAMP deficiency. We began screening on October 1st, 2018. We've picked up one child. I think the same as in Utah, who began screening before us or picked up a baby before us. Other conditions like homocystinuria have been on the panel since the 80s, and at least in New York, and we find one every year or two. And so I don't want to get, I don't know that it's fair to sort of talk about the numbers. It's a rare disease. A lot of effort has gone into trying to develop the best possible algorithm to get these children into care as soon as possible. And I think on some level, it's actually a benefit that there's so few infants, because that allows us to focus our efforts on those few families and be able to assist. As was mentioned, the treatment centers are very involved in helping out to make sure these kids get seen and get into care and formal diagnosis and everything necessary for a transplant as soon as possible. And so I do think a lot of the pieces are in place. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate that. Natasha.
Natasha Benham, Genetic Alliance. And appreciate the conversation. It definitely seems like outside of this vote, there are a number of conversations that this committee may want to take up in terms of the themes that have been discussed within discussing this vote. I did want to build upon what Michelle just said in terms of rare diseases. And yes, there are small numbers, but there are 30 million Americans who have rare diseases. So let's think about which numbers we want to include in the dialogue, and when we're talking about which numbers and the impact of that. And I have to say that I don't know if concerning is the right word, but it's interesting to be talking about such small numbers, because we're talking about rare diseases. So if we're not talking about that, then what are what are we talking about, right? What is the purpose of this committee and where is its focus? So I just think that these themes that have come up, they're not just Krabbe related, and they're not just related to this vote. They're related to, I would think, the work of this committee and the work that is connected to newborn screening overall. So again, it's not just about Krabbe.
Thanks, Natasha. Robert? Robert? Bob Ostrander?
There we go. It's 3 minutes. Unmute on my phone. Robert O'Connor, ACHDNC. I just talked for a second. That's really a question about concerns people seem to have about the cyclotron cutoff of can somehow costing this opportunity for other things. I mean, the last time we had this discussion, the fact that related
Bob, hey,
yeah.
Bob, we can't understand you.
Sorry, maybe it's not going to work. I'm stuck here in the airport. Never mind.
I would at this point like to entertain a motion. The Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders of Newborns and Children Committee recommends adding infantile Krabbe disease as defined by low GALC enzyme activity and cytosine greater than 10 nm for inclusion as a core condition on the RUSP. Is someone interested in making that motion?
Sean McCandless, committee member, I make the motion.
Thanks, Sean. Is there a second?
I second.
Thanks, Jennifer.
If the vote goes the wrong way, we want to be on the public record as having at least moved and seconded.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, I really do appreciate the vulnerability people show, the thoughtfulness people put into their statements. And I want to underline the understanding and hope that people respect people for the values and experiences they bring to the table, their willingness to discuss them in open forum, and to have them visible to people who disagree, and then to do that in a respectful way. I'd like to hold that and keep it in mind going forward, regardless of the outcome of the vote or the individual voting decisions that people around the table and online make. With that, I wonder if I could turn to Letitia for a roll call vote.
Thank you. From the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, Kamala Mistry.
Here?
Oh, I'm
Would
sorry.
you please answer yes, you approve
yes.
the motion, or no? Thank you.
Yes.
Michelle Kajana,
Yes.
Carla Cuthbert,
Yes.
Janine Cody,
Yes.
Christine Dorley.
Yes.
From the Food and Drug Administration, Paula Capacino.
Yes.
From the Health Resources and Services Administration, Michael Warren,
Yes.
Jennifer Kwan,
No.
Ash Law,
Yes.
Sean McCandless.
No.
From the National Institute of Health, Melissa Parisi,
Yes.
Shanika Ponpakul,
Yes.
and Ned Kalonge.
No. The result of the vote? Just the count. The result of the vote is 10-3. So the committee has voted in favor of recommending Krabbe disease to the RUSP. I will prepare a letter for the secretary with the recommendation from the advisory committee. Please remember that the secretary makes the final decision on whether or not to accept the committee's recommendation. This decision will be posted on the committee's website. I'd like to thank everyone involved in the nomination, the evidence-based review, and the decision-making process, including members of the committee, the ERG, the technical expert panel, of course, my fellow committee members, our organizational representatives, and the fine staff at HRSA that put together such a great meeting. Finally, I again want to thank the members of the public, advocates and family members alike make its decision and to move newborn screening forward. At this time, I'm not going to take a break. I understand we're not going to go with APHL presentation today, which is good. I would ask if there's any additional new business to bring in front of the committee today. Seeing none, I would thank everybody I just thanked a second time, especially the folks who helped get us here and get us back home, help set up the meeting, that wonderful staff that Michael, Jeff, and the rest of the teams put together to help these meetings move smoothly, almost smoothly, completely. And I want to thank our AV folks as well, because it really was about as good as it's ever gone since I've been here. So thank you so much. We will be meeting again in May, and if I could remember those days, that would be miraculous. There it is, 9th to 10th. It is a miracle. So thanks again, and safe travels for all of you heading back home. Thanks.